All right, howdy folks. We are back on the record in the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission's November 16th hearing. We have concluded with party closing statements as well as staff closing statement. And I believe that we're going to start up this afternoon's session with questions from commissioners to our staff and to the CPW staff who presented as well. So with that, would turn to commissioners for questions. Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I wanted to just really thank the staff for the excellent presentations. And I think the closing was very thorough in terms of addressing the issues that have been raised and the questions that have come up, and really appreciated especially that last bit from Mr. Elm on the sage grouse current rules and et cetera on BLM land. So thank you again for all of that. I just had a quick question to clarify. I think I know the answer, but I just want to make sure that it's very clear. So outside of high priority habitat, when an application comes in, CPW is looking at those or is kind of scanning for areas that might be overlapping with other species of interest, you know, that didn't meet the qualifications for our high priority habitat, but are otherwise statewide priority species or maybe state tier E species. I just wanted to confirm that was correct, and then I have a couple of related sub questions with that.
Mr. Holtz.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Nanjapa. Yeah, that is correct. We see all of the applications, whether they are not currently in sensitive wildlife habitat or restricted service occupancy, and we do screen those for those resources that you mentioned. One of the big ones under the current rules is for T&E species, because we are often sort of relied on to sort of trigger that aspect and pull in the feds who have jurisdiction on that issue. So yes, we do.
Thank you, Mr. Holst. And if, so we talked a little bit about with some of the stakeholders yesterday, the event that critical habitat is not designated for a federal tier E species, which I know happens. It's not technically required, or there's not a timing stipulation the way there is with other parts of the Endangered Species Act. And so given the way that our rules are written, where it's talking about, you know, when the consultation occurs, when it falls within critical habitat that's been designated, what about those instances when it's not?
Mr. Holtz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Commissioner Nanjapa. So in those instances, you know, that's the instance where we would be relying on our local staff, all those DWMs that Mr. Ackerman mentioned, and our biologists that are in the areas to basically screen that and have those localities. You know, if we have a known active southwestern willow flycatcher nest, for example, that's outside of mapped critical habitat, then we would bring that to the attention and request a consult in that circumstance. It does put pressure on our staff. I mean, that is, you know, but I think it is really the only way we can handle those instances.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. And so I believe you addressed this before, but in those instances, then you may require certain conditions of approval or particular stipulations or distances based on what's that particular species, correct?
Mr. Holtz.
Yes, I mean, I would say that we would request them, and it would be up to the commission to require them. Okay,
thank you. And then two last pieces related to this. So endemic plants came up, and I know that, or at least my understanding of CPW's sort of purview over plants is relatively new with the merger with parks, but I wasn't sure kind of how that works statewide with some of these endemic plants, and Are those things that you're looking out for as well when you're assessing these when the applications are coming in?
Mr. Holtz?
Yes, thanks, Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Najapa. I would say we're not looking at those like we do for the things that we have jurisdiction over. I mean, it's not that we ignore them. We do have our natural areas program, and we certainly are looking out for endemic plants associated with those natural areas. But generally, our screening does not include endemic plants.
Okay, and then last but not least, if you are, if one of the areas comes up where there's a priority species that's a smaller critter, I was just looking at your fencing guidance, and it seems like it's mostly geared towards larger animals and birds. Would you put additional stipulations for exclusion fencing? For example, if there's Preble's jumping mouse or something else there.
Mr. Holst?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, we would. In fact, we have done that in certain circumstances. We've requested things like silt fence at the bottom of some of that larger fencing to, exclude smaller critters. So we have done that on occasion. And, back to your previous question, Commissioner Najab, if I may, we do on our own properties where we do have a good record of endemic plants, we do screen on those properties specifically. We just don't do that on properties that we don't manage.
Further questions?
No, thank you very much. Really appreciate that.
Other commissioners that would like to weigh in with questions? Commissioner Mcgowan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I apologize, I'm kind of going to be all over the place. So I'm going to start off with what I hope is low-hanging fruit and something that no one's talked about, but you and I talked about in one of our kind of pre-meetings, which is there a reason that we're trying to address West Nile virus and mosquito control in only high priority habitat areas? And is it possible for us to apply that rule to all pits? So, okay, so sorry.
I wasn't sure who was going to unmute.
Thank you, Chairman. Neither were we. So that role currently resides in our high priority habitat, or in our sensitive wildlife habitat suite of rules, and so we didn't propose changing that to statewide, just frankly due to the nexus with our partners at CPW. I don't necessarily think we would object to looking at that on a statewide basis.
Thank you. Sorry, again, jumping all over the place. There's no nexus to any of these questions. So I'd like to talk a little bit about if there were a waiver process in 1202C, what the workload for staff would look like. And just from a layperson's perspective, it feels like consultation is already happening on a case-by-case basis with CPW. So would it be an increased workload if there were a waiver process in 1202C? And could you talk a little bit about currently how we work with operators and what the role of the relevant local government might be?
Multi-pronged question. Who wants to take a stab at it? Mr. Ackerman?
Sure, I'll go first. Thank you. And I'll answer that first part and ask Mr. Holtz to chime in on the second part of that question. Excuse me. And that's a great question, Commissioner Mcgowan. Thank you. The answer is likely yes. And really the amount of additional workload would depend on what that waiver process looked like. We've had various discussions throughout the hearings today as to what that might look like and what its parameters are. So yes, it would be additional work, although that's not certainly our driving force. Our intent is to, as I'm sure you're driving at, is to employ the most effective strategy going forward. So directly to answer your question, yes, additional work. We can do additional work if it goes that direction, and certainly have more to say about waivers if you have other questions.
Chairman, if I may follow up on that.
Yeah, sorry. Yes, please.
Thanks. So just from the COGCC perspective, I would say it's probably not a significant difference from COGCC staff perspective, whether we're looking at a waiver from CPW or a recommendation on a variance from CPW. In either case, we are considering that information as we go through our process, and also considering, any public comments, relevant local government comments, federal input, et cetera. So, I think all of that factors into our decision to make a recommendation to the commission either way.
What about the relevant local government part of the question? Mr. Holst?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. So we do, when we get contacted by, or we get an e-notification through e-forms from COGCC, if the local government has expressed an interest in oil and gas permitting in their county, we do engage the local government. We try and, even if it's a BLM on site or depending on where it is, we try and engage everybody at the same time, just because it's a staff, it's kind of a staff efficiency issue. So to the extent we can actually get everybody out to look at the location at one time to discuss all the issues, it saves us a lot of staff time and energy. So we try and do that to the extent we can.
Commissioner Mcgowan?
Okay, again, I'm heading down a different trail. Sorry, I just have a list of questions. I think that I'm still trying to work my way through understanding gold medal. So sorry, I'm mixing apples and oranges and bananas and monkeys. So I feel like there's kind of two ways of looking at how we're trying to protect habitat. And one is by defining how the habitat is used. So gold medal fisheries or for cutthroat trout or for other species. But then there's also kind of this discussion around perennial waters versus intermittent and ephemeral. And I'm trying to figure out how those pieces kind of come together and whether or not a 500-foot setback is what's really necessary to protect those different kinds of uses and the different kinds of streams that exist, and whether or not the 500-foot setback for ephemeral and ephemeral and intermittent streams is truly necessary. I'm not wording it right because I know that it's necessary because it's what the proposal is, but whether or not the 500-foot setback feels like again, I keep using blunt instrument, but we're applying it to everything, and I'm pretty sure that not all streams are created equal. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about is a 500-foot setback for either the gold medal streams, which I'm assuming are mostly perennial, but maybe I'm completely wrong. So I'd like someone to address that for me, and a lesser setback for the other two species and or a lesser setback for intermittent and ephemeral. And so I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about that. Sorry, that's all over the place, but it's hard for me to kind of parse them out, sorry.
Mr. Holst, do you want to take a shot at that question that involved monkeys?
Sure, Mr. Chairman, thank you, Commissioner Mcgowan. I might start and then maybe defer to Mr. Ackerman. And we also have a number of species experts, aquatics experts on the line too, that could probably chime in on this. But so I don't have off the top of my head, and in fact, I'm not sure we split this out when we kind of split up the data, the percentage of gold medal waters that are intermittent and ephemeral. I do have the numbers for sport fish management waters, which encompass gold medal waters. Gold medal waters are a really small percentage, frankly, of overall sport fish management waters. And so, we do have those numbers. I think Mr. Duranlo referred to them in his testimony today. I mean, it's roughly 30% of sport fish waters are intermittent. I think it's, a very small percentage, like around 1% is ephemeral or even less. And then for native fish waters, it's around 45% is intermittent, and also another very small percentage, I think less than 1% is ephemeral. And so whether or not, in our statement of basis and purpose, there is a lot of good documentation in there of the importance of those intermittent and ephemeral, particularly, for native species. I mean, they are very, very important for some of our native species. And so whether or not a smaller buffer is warranted, I think, we could probably get some of our experts on the phone here on the video. But I think we ended up where we are because of just the body of literature that's in the statement of basis and purpose, and what we felt would be appropriate for sort of a one-size-fits-all approach for waters that we've recommended. I mean, certainly there are techniques. There are a number of techniques where we could come up with a gradated approach, but it kind of goes both ways. I mean, the first order streams that are like those cutthroat waters, those are ones that, maybe the buffer should be smaller because the drainages are smaller and we have more topography constraints. But when you get to the larger streams, 500 feet does not, in many cases, even cover the 100-year floodplain for the larger streams. And so if we were going to go with that approach, I think we'd have to look at it in both directions. So I'll pass that on to Mr. Ackerman to see if he has anything to add.
Mr. Ackerman?
I sure do. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner McGowan. And I certainly can appreciate the critical thought that's going through your head right now. This is a tough issue. And like I mentioned in my opening, there are several different ways to approach this, and the way that we've chosen to approach it is, once again, easy to understand, easy to administer, grossly protects the habitat throughout the state, but admittedly is not precise in many places, and especially where it comes to ephemeral and intermittent streams, hence the reason that we've proposed a waiver in the draft regulations specifically for those streams. But we've also we kicked around a lot of alternatives in ways to do this. Certainly you could rely upon the FEMA floodplain for every waterway, and we could map them that way. You could have a belt width approach and scientifically map each stream in the state. And as Mr. Hulse pointed out, certainly this could be up to 3,000 foot setbacks out on the plains and much smaller setbacks in the upper waters, which would be more precise, but harder to predict, harder to interpret, and harder to understand what you were getting into. So understanding that riparian areas have to be protected or should be protected under best management practices, there are trade-offs either way. So it's tough to, you're exactly right, it's tough to mine for the exact best approach here.
Commissioner McGowan?
Sorry, last question, then I'm sure I'll have more as other folks talk. I'm wondering if staff could clarify for me, when someone asks for a variance under the 500 series, does that trigger a separate hearing before the OGTP, the oil and gas plan, comes to the commission for final approval? Is it a separate standalone hearing?
Director Murphy?
Thank you for the question, Commissioner McGowan. And no, it is not a separate hearing. There are some rule provisions in which for an operation that was already in existence and you needed a variance from an operational standard going forward, that would be an independent hearing. However, when we're talking about locating a new oil and gas pad somewhere, and if there were a rule it could not comply with or the operator sought to deviate from, whether it's wildlife, operational safety, that would be part of the package of information presented to you to decide whether to approve or separately condition or deny that permit request.
And that makes perfect sense that we would be looking at kind of the totality of circumstances. Commissioner McGowan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm trying to understand the argument, I think, from industry that maybe I have it backwards. Or the argument that we're trying to make, which is the variance is pretty secure. You know what you're gonna get versus the waiver might change, or maybe is it the other way around that's being argued? It seems to me that you will not really know with finality until it goes to the commission and the commission has a discussion and runs through it. Would that be accurate?
Commissioner
Murphy?
McGowan, thank you. Commissioner McGowan, in my estimation, there is no certainty about a permit until this commission makes a decision. Whether that's a waiver being sought through a CPW approval or whether that's a variance being sought. it's conceivable that I, the director, could reject either of those two or recommend denial. There are lots of pieces in question. I think the timing question to me from industry in particular is if CPW would support this, why not go ahead and be able to lock in their support early, which I understand. But I think that what we tried to illustrate in our closing remarks is whether it is securing a variance or CPW support for a variance or a CPW approved exception, either of those two components still go to this commission for ultimate decision.
Yeah, I agree. Commissioner Messner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I will also say thank you for the closing presentation, because I do think, I wish I would have heard that before we started some of the deliberations, because I think the deliberations would have been shorter from my end, but nonetheless, I appreciate the responses. Now, I do have some specific questions, though, and again, let's go to the variance timing as proposed. And so you've got an OGDP 2A application, brand new oil and gas location. You've got a pre-application conference with CPW to determine, for the ALA or for any number of reasons, right? But as they're starting to put their package together for their application for their oil and gas development plan, they have that consultation. They indicate to CPW that they may be interested in proposing a location that is going to be inside of one of the buffers that we have in the 1200 series. CPW, I guess my question is, what kind of information besides like the straight up, no, that's clear that there's no species in that area. We just know that, right? But I assume in some situations, there's some study or some analysis or some significant amount of information that needs to be contemplated in order to be able to even give an initial nod. Yeah, that may get our support in a variance hearing, or no, it may not get our support. And so I guess my question is, what is that level of information that CPW is going to need, and who provides that information in a pre-application conference?
Director Murphy?
Thank you, Commissioner, for the question. To me, that kind of goes to the heart of how CPW would evaluate a request like this coming forward, so I may defer to Mr. Holst.
Mr. Holst?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Mesner, it's a great question. I think, we would look at the site-specific circumstance, and, we would have to come up with our rationale, whatever that is based on, under these new rules of how citing that location would be protective of the wildlife resource. And, that could include things like some of the folks mentioned in the Peons with some of the topography issues with greater sage grouse, where we could see potentially, I could see a location within a greater sage grouse like RSO that essentially it's such a vertical topographic shift from where the lek is located that we could basically say that it's not likely to disturb that lek based on the information we have from studies that have been done up there by our researcher Brett Walker and others. And then we could lay that out as sort of an evidentiary, kind of note for the commission to take note of. So I think it would be, would depend on the information that's available site specifically. I'm trying to envision a circumstance where it might also include some sort of mitigative, other type of mitigative issue, but that's the one that comes to mind. So I think it would be, and that would go forward, with the permit application as part of the commission evaluation of that permit application. That's how I see it happening anyway.
And in that situation, as we go into a variance and we utilize the existing rules as proposed, which would be a variance proceeding, the burden of proof lies on the applicant. And so I guess that's my question, is that there's going to potentially be you know, financial implications for doing analysis, for staff time, for, you know, figuring out exactly what this is. And I'm trying to make sure that in the process that we're developing, particularly in this pre-application consultation. So, I mean, I get it in a pre-application consultation where you can make an initial, yeah, that may work, or no, there's no way that's going to work. That doesn't preclude an applicant for being able to say, no, we're going to move forward with a variance or not. But I'd hate to see CPW get into a situation where they become where they hold the burden of proof, whereas that burden of proof needs to be held by the applicant, and the applicant needs to provide the analysis and the data and the whatever is necessary to provide CPW in order to ultimately make whatever determination, recommendation that they would make in the variance process. So I'm just trying to figure out where that's captured in our draft.
Mr. Ackerman?
Thank you, Commissioner Messner. Maybe I can start and then someone can help me on where that's captured in our draft. But I think you've hit on one of the crux of the issues here and why we've seen such heavy conversation around this issue itself, which seems like a small issue in a small geographic part of the state. But I think that that is resultant of exactly of what you've said, of the burden of proof. I think that if they're flagged as NSOs and the presumption is that they're NSOs and that the burden of proof is on the operator to come before this commission and argue why, with CPW support or without CPW support, they should be able to operate there. That seems like the appropriate place for that burden if we're determining that these are important enough to be NSO habitats. If they are listed as NSO but with a staff level waiver, which in my opinion, staff level waivers work within the presumption of the greater presumption that the public is comfortable with that waiver process. In these hearings, we certainly have heard a lot of concerns from the public that they would like to see more discussion about that. And so I'm a bit uncomfortable with my staff having to determine that waiver and the burden being upon my staff, because in the field, the situation that would likely occur would be, we'd like to drill here, CPW, prove to us on each proposed impact why we shouldn't be able to do that based on empirical evidence. And we may or may not be able to do that based on some of the discussion that I put forth earlier today. And it's not as protective of that habitat in a way that an NSO should be, in our opinion. And so philosophically, even though that's not captured in the regulations, that's an important point of how this would likely proceed in the field. Perhaps somebody can help me with where that is indeed captured. Mr. Dronmo?
Thanks, if I may, Chairman.
Yeah.
So, I'd like to say that that's really captured in the entirety of the 309E consultation process. And so if indeed, we have this pre-application consult, the operator is advocating for, as we've drafted it, a variance from the consult procedure, and from any provision under 1202, or whether it's C or D, that can then play out in that initial discussion once their application is in process. And CPW can come in and say, yeah, based on the information we saw on the onsite, we would support this variance, and they can take the time in our process while the permit is progressing towards its ultimate hearing to do follow-up research, engage any additional experts, see whether there are public comments who have local, specific local knowledge, and all of that can inform their ultimate recommendation on that. Whereas to just commit to that on the onsite right away doesn't sort of allow for that full and informed decision and recommendation by CPW.
No, and I understand that, and I appreciate that. But let me dig a little deeper here, because I think this is where I struggle with it a little bit, because we are asking CPW to engage with an operator in a pre-application conference or consultation. in which CPW is being asked to kind of give a draft thumbs up or down on whether or not that site may or may not be appropriate in CPW's mind, with little to no, knowledge. I mean, certainly there's knowledge and expertise and professionalism, but I mean, as far as any additional information that they need to be provided, as far as a burden of proof from the applicant to be provided to CPW in order to be able to give that draft thumbs up or down, because the operator at that stage, based on the CPW's thumbs up or down, in the pre-application stage is going to move forward with an entire application, which can be a significant investment of time and effort and money in order to be able to propose that particular site. And then we go to the variance process within that application. And so, and I think that's where I struggle a little bit with the timing of the variance. And so let me just ask that question first, because that'll inform the rest of this. Is when does the actual variance hearing happen? Is that
At the GDP stage?
Well, I understand, but where in the OGDP stage? Is it simultaneous with the final hearing and decision making that we're making on the OGDP application?
I think, yeah, I mean, and again, Commissioner Messner, I'm not staff, but we're building a ship that we're going to sail at the same time. We've not had one of these hearings yet, but I sort of envision that the best approach to this is that we're looking at everything all at the same time, and it's the applicant's burden of proof. I would anticipate that if an applicant is basing a proposed OGDP based upon a location that requires a variance, they're going to address that first in their presentation to staff, because if they can't get past that hurdle, then there's no reason to move into the rest of the hearing. But I think, Director Murphy, help me with this, but I think that our rules are fluid enough that we could do it all at once, do the variance first, have a preliminary vote, do the rest of the OGDP, whatever. I don't think that they're hard set as we have set them in place.
Chair, I'd have to think a little bit about notice requirements, right? And kind of preliminary orders and early thumbs up gets me a little bit squeamish. And I think the other thing that's really hard to do is to look in isolation singularly at an early variance, whether it's at a wildlife issue or a pipeline issue or a secondary containment issue. Seeing that without the benefit of the rest of the package will give the short shrift to the commissioners as they're evaluating whether this is a good idea or not.
Yeah, and my musings were not saying that we're going to see that absent the rest of the package. I'm saying we're looking at the whole package together. This is the question that we asked earlier, is when do we do it? And it's when we're looking at the full OGDP. And some operators may be proposing 10 locations in an OGDP. 2 of which need variances, but they may also be suggesting that if you look at the full thing, 8 are outside the area, 2 are in. As a cumulative approach, this is a good idea, and they may try to convince us of that. I'm seeing hands flying all over the place, so I'm going to shut up, and I'm going to go to Commissioner Mcgowan first.
So I'm really interested in this conversation because I think if I'm an operator and I know that one of my variances is not going to fly, I probably would not invest a lot of time putting together the rest of the information needed for an OGDP. And so to Commissioner Messner's point, and I guess why I was asking before, if the 500 variance process was a separate hearing that happened earlier, and I get that it's hard to look at it in a vacuum, as an operator, it might help you decide whether or not you wanted to proceed because you were getting support from staff and or the commission to keep moving. I also understand the point of looking at it in a vacuum might not be very successful, but I also am pretty appreciative of kind of how much time and energy and investment do I put into something if I don't know it's really going to be successful. So I'm trying to figure out how we might balance that.
Director Murphy, did you want to respond?
I do. I want to suggest to you that we think it makes more sense, and there's nothing in the rules that preclude gaining CPW support for a variance as compared to a waiver, right? And that to me is the only appropriate early assurance, because again, I would rather have a complete package come to the commissioners. And I can also envision situations where an operator moves forward with a proposed location without CPW support, and that the rules contemplate that outcome as well. And that could be a totally appropriate location. There's, like I said, there are a myriad of factors and considerations that go into each location. Wildlife is one of them. I think the one thing that I want to kind of keep us focused on is trying to get through questions for staff and then going into kind of the dialogue between commissioners about what you want to change about staff's proposal and trying to walk that line.
Thank you, Director Murphy. I think that's sage advice. Commissioner Najapa?
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate all of these questions. They're kind of related to what I was going to ask. And I just want to make sure that I was clear too with 304B to B8 as it's provided. So the ALA is always required when the proposed location's within high priority habitat. But then it also says, and the operator did not obtain a waiver from CPW. But I wanted to make sure that I was understanding correctly how this interacts with 1202C, because 1202C is the high priority habitat and it's all NSO. So when would be the instance, or maybe this is kind of what we were throwing out before, that maybe in the ALA, the only other viable location or the only viable locations in general are within our 1202C habitats. And so in that case, is it just a denial? I'm just trying to understand how those interact. If you could help me.
Mr. Duranlo?
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for the question. So the waiver in 304 is only for the completion of the ALA provision. It is not, it doesn't extend to the waiver of the, let's say, for example, 1 mile setback from a grouse lek, or a greater sage grouse lek to be more specific. So it's only waiving that ALA provision.
Okay, I see. So the ALA has to occur unless CPW waives it, but it's not a waiver in general for other operational requirements. Okay, got it. And then similarly, you had mentioned in your closing, Mr. Duranlo, about 309E3C. And I think you said that that applies to 1202C and D. Is that specifically in those instances where the habitat just no longer exists?
That's correct. Thank you for the question. And that is, so E3C doesn't have that restriction in applicability. So if the species and habitat are no longer present, and CPW agrees with that, and staff agrees with that analysis, then yes, that can waive. Essentially, that eliminates that provision of that being an NSO.
Commissioner Gonzalez, I think you had your hand up next, and then Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'll say it again, you've heard it before, but I had the presentation given by CPWN and COGCC staff for closing today addressed a lot of the items that have come up in testimony, and I really appreciate that. And I also think that the explanation by Mr. Duranlo in terms of how the variance process works in reality has really cleared up a lot of things for me in that regard as well. So I appreciate that. I do have some clarifying questions that I kind of want to fill some of the holes with. And so I guess what I understood from you is that if a OGDP is presented by an applicant to staff for consideration, it could be done at the same time as the variance application, or the variance application could be part of that OGDP. So therefore, the staff is not going to be waiting on the variance approval while analyzing the entirety of the rest of the OGDP. I see heads nodding, so I understand that correctly. Okay. So then in terms of in terms of the process, you know, I was thinking about it as the decision making was kind of 6 of one, half dozen of another, right? Ultimately ends up with the commission. It's a yay or nay. But now it seems like kind of all those steps align all the way through, whether it's a variance or a waiver on the pre-application. What I don't understand is, are there additional timing considerations that would go into a variance process that may cause any delays to what would otherwise be a waiver then OGDP process, and what those timing what those timing additions would be?
Mr. Dronlo?
Unless Director Murphy wants to take it, I'll take a stab at it. I feel like you've given me, you know, a question about the process of how staff is going to go through our review on this. And I feel like that is the you know, a big part of that consultation period is for staff to ask the probative questions of our wildlife consultant, CPW, you know, what we need to know about the circumstance in order to make our recommendation to the commission. And so I think the timing consideration, if we were to say this is simply waived early in the process, I think staff doesn't get the full opportunity to understand, you know, why it was waived and why we can also support this application as being protective. Whereas if we have the timing of the consultation intact in the process, then we can move through that, you know, take our time, understand the situation, go back and forth with the federal land manager who may, you know, maybe there's different land use authorities who are not quite on the same page, and we can work through those differences. And the time frame allows for that.
Yeah, and I think that the timing that you alluded to or described, Mr. Duranlo, is basically just kind of the timing for evaluation that would otherwise be part of the OGDP evaluation. And I think part of my question was additional notice. Are there any kind of timeout periods that would be created by the variance process that would delay an OGDP evaluation or ultimate decision? It's my understanding that notice for variances go to CPW, COGCC, and relevant local government, and then to any other impacted persons as directed by the director. And so that's a pretty limited group, right? And they're all part of the process as it is from the initial consultation. So I'm just trying to understand, you know, would that notice run concurrently with the OGDP process? Really trying to kind of align the timing here to, at the end of the day, I want to understand that if these are both the same or not.
AAG Minor has shown up for the first time this afternoon. Mr. Duranlo, you can certainly try to answer, but I'm just giving you a heads up. You got Minor below you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'd like to start just by making one point, and that's that, you know, we do have similar provisions in our consultation process for CDPHE, and where there is a variance requested as part of an oil and gas development plan that triggers a CDPHE consult, and we would expect that application run through its you know, normal process, with the decision on the variance being made, you know, at the ultimate approval or denial or conditional approval of the oil and gas development plan at the back end. So I think that's I think we're very consistent in how we're treating that with respect to these 1202C habitats.
Thank you, Mr. Minor, I guess.
Mr. Minor, did you want to weigh in on that?
Sure, I don't really have anything to add to Mr. Duranlo's comment. I just wanted to quickly revisit Commissioner Gonzalez's point about the notice required for variance applications. So if you look at Rule 504, 504B7, this is the notice provisions for applications for variance. The very final sentence of that rule says that for any variance requested as part of an application subject to Rules 504B1 through 6, no additional notice will be required. And Rule 504B1 is the notice for an oil and gas development plan. So that's a long way of saying that there actually isn't a separate noticing provision for a variance that's requested as a component of an oil and gas development plan. It just goes through the same notice process as the rest of the OGDP. So the only time a variance has to get noticed separately is if it's not being considered in the context of a new permit application. So I hope if that answers the question, that there's really no additional notice requirements required for the types of variances that we're talking about here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minor. I've got one more question, Chair, but you're happy to pop in, or if you'd like.
I just was going to follow up on this same line of inquiry, if it's okay. AAG Minor, as I read 502, which I have up on one of my other screens, it appears to me that if an operator is pursuing, let's say we go with the variance and we don't go with the waiver, and an operator wants to pursue a variance to a 1202C provision, that it really is the operator's call as to whether they proceed with that variance on its own before they move forward with the OGDP, or they decide to do it all together. I think it may be inefficient if they go on their own, but I don't read the rule as being exclusive that you would always have to pursue the variance as part of an OGDP. Can you weigh in on that?
I can try that. That might be a better question for Director Murphy or even really Ms. Larson, who's I believe we don't have this afternoon. I don't think anything would in terms of, is it possible to get a docket number assigned a variance application that is independent of an OGDP? I think the answer is yes. I think the hearing system could probably process that. I think that would be a really challenging decision for the commission to make, because I think that the request for a variance, it's not really the rule that it is requesting a variance from is so tied to the overall location assessment process and the OGDP application process that I'm not sure that makes sense in context. So in terms of, does the rule allow that, and could the hearing system sort of process that type of request? I think the answer is yes. That's how 502C is written, or sorry, 502B is written, but I'll sort of turn it back to Director Murphy or Mr. Dronlo to answer whether that really would work in practice.
And I'll answer on behalf of both of those staff, is that I think there's a great deal of inefficiencies if it were to go that route, but I am trying to figure out the parameters if we do a variance process, and I want to note that the options exist for operators. I guess one other thing that I would suggest to my fellow commissioners is, again, we're trying to ask questions, but we're also sort of starting to deliberate a little bit. I think one of the seminal things that we need to determine early on, once we get to deliberations, is, are we comfortable with the draft as drafted without an exception or waiver, and have the off-ramps that are built in already, and using a variance, or do we think that we need to have this waiver that has been talked about so much, as opposed to going the direction that we've received from staff? So I just point that out there and flag that's first on my list, at least. Commissioner Njapa, I think you were up next. Oh, Commissioner Gonzalez, you had one more. That's right.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I've got two pieces of follow-up. I'll make one comment on something you said, Chair Robbins. I think that the inefficiencies that industry was citing, the inefficiencies that I was concerned about, were in the context of a sequential variance OGDP process, where you would go through the whole variance process, get that, and then go through the whole OGDP process. So what we've discussed here in the last 10 minutes or so has been very helpful in kind of dispelling, at least in my mind, from that particular perspective, the inefficiencies that would, or I guess that were proposed to have occurred through the variance process. So I'll say that. I've got two more questions that I'm going to throw out. One is going to be under the elements necessary of showing for a variance. The could not in good faith comply with the rules, or complying with the rules would create an undue hardship. Some of the examples that we heard about were where there may be a beneficial location within a buffer. And if that occurs, and that beneficial location is within a buffer and it is signed off on by COGCC or CPW, does the commission then waive the elements of showing that the applicant has to put forth for the variance under 502 C1 through 5.
Director Murphy, did you want to?
I think that's a very good question, Commissioner. It's a little philosophical because I think that there could be a number of reasons why compliance with the NSO wasn't possible. Topography, mineral location, drilling technologies, like those are other components. And so I think that could be worked through on a case-by-case basis. In short answer, and it's also really, I want to be fairly careful talking about it because I think variances in these kinds of situations seem to be pretty fact specific. But I do see a path in that arena.
Okay. Yeah, and the reasoning behind my question is that I'm concerned that an applicant goes up and says, hey, I'm not compliant, you know, I have the opportunity to be outside this buffer, but we have consulted with CPW and we think it should be, you know, 450 feet inside this buffer, whatever. So they can't attest to some of those elements. And I'd be concerned that maybe someone who is challenging that application would seek to have it dismissed on the grounds they didn't meet all the elements necessary for a variance. And I don't know how all that works. So that's a concern that kind of popped into my head. I want to throw that out there. The next question I had is, could CPW abstain from a variance consultation request? Meaning, could they just say, hey, I'm not going to participate in this, deal with it with us 5 commissioners, and, you know, as the deciding body, I guess.
Mr. Ackerman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner Gonzalez, for the question. And it might have been directed at staff, but I appreciate you letting me take a shot there. And I would say that certainly, yes, we could. That falls within the purview of what we could engage in and what we couldn't engage in. Would we? I would suggest that it wouldn't be a very responsible approach on our part if we were abstaining from that for any reason other than some kind of conflict of interest.
Thank you, Mr. Ackerman.
That's all my questions, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Okay. I think that Commissioner Nanjapa had her hand up first, and then Commissioner Messner, I see that you're on deck.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going in a different direction. So Commissioner Messner, if you're still on this topic, I'd be happy to shift over to you.
I think
Is that a waving away? Okay. Okay. So I just had a couple of more kind of wildlife specific questions. One of them was the comment from industry about some of the big game populations in the DJ Basin, that they were coexisting with the development and within 10% of the population objectives. And then I think we also heard from TRCP that, or just some speculation that maybe that was not accurate or it could be adjusted down. I was just wondering if you could just comment on that in terms of the status of the big game populations in that area.
Mr. Holst?
Sure. You know, I might have to call in one of our big game experts who's online in terms of that particular area, but I can tell you generally with our big game herd management plans, we do not track very well when we do ratchet down, as Mr. Arnett mentioned from TRCP, our population objectives. So in fact, you know, those do or have in the past where we've had populations declining, those objectives do go down over time potentially without reflecting that sort of long-term decline of a population. So that is a distinct possibility. But I might see if we've got Brian Dreher on the phone. I think he could probably talk specifically to those particular herd management units out there. And if not, Brad Banulis, if he's available.
Okay. Thank you,
Hearings
Mr.
Manager Thomas, if you could.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Okay, yeah.
Hello, it's nice to speak with you, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, Director Murphy, Brian Dreher, Terrestrial Section Manager for Colorado Parks and Wildlife. And I think what I understand the question is that the question is associated with kind of our herd management objectives for the area in and around the Piance Basin. Is that correct? I just want to make sure that that I got that accurate.
Commissioner Nanjapa?
Thank you, Mr. Dreher. No, it was actually about the DJ Basin, and there was a comment about the populations there sort of coexisting within 10% of the population objectives, and then there was a subsequent comment about perhaps those objectives have been adjusted down and that we're maybe on more of a downward trend, and so I just wanted to get a better sense of that. It kind of related to how we might contemplate the rules in 1202D.
So and thanks for that question. I think that maybe this will help, is that we set our herd management objectives on a 10-year basis, roughly. And so we update our herd management plans on average, or with the goal of trying to do that once every 10 years. And so obviously that happens throughout the process. And so some of these objectives will actually change through time. So anyway, we do have a number of our herd management plans in the northeast corner of the state right now that are under revision. But those are actually going to be presented later this week at our Wildlife Commission meeting, and those will then, if the commission then approves, would then go in place as our new objectives, our new population objectives. Does that help at all?
I think so. I mean, so maybe you're unable to really say whether there's been any changes in that population status. Is that kind of what you're getting at? I was just kind of curious, has there been a change in that population status? In other words, you know, with some of the requests being made for 1202D, they would potentially change or maybe reduce some of the protections that we're contemplating. And so I'm just trying to understand how the populations are doing in that area.
As far as I know, based on the existing plans, the objectives are not expected to change in terms of upward or downward trend. I believe they've actually been pretty stable.
Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate you joining in for answering that question. I had one more that I think Mr. Holst, you probably could answer. It's related to Gunnison sage grouse and some of the information from La Plata County. I was just curious if you could comment a little bit about what we know about the declines in that area, you know, given that that's one of the larger subpopulations, and that there have been declines around those leks, and you know, looks like most of the facilities are further than a mile, but there is a greater density. And so, yeah, I just wanted to kind of better understand what we knew about the declines in that area, especially given that sounds like the most recent facility that was built was like 9 years ago.
Mr. Holst.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Najapa. You know, it's a great question. And, you know, I'm not sure, honestly, we know, or that we can attribute it to one single factor. As that nice slide that La Plata County and those folks showed, most of that development is actually on the sort of rim of the basin, and most of the leks are actually out in the basin. It is an area that is sort of on the edge of dryness in terms of where we see Gunnison grouse, and it's been getting drier over the last decade or so. And so if that slide were expanded, and I think one of their slides in their initial presentation showed our Miramone population, which is just a slightly higher in elevation from that population, is actually doing okay. And so it could be precipitation related. There are some BLM folks that thinks it's predation related. There's a tremendous raven population out there. And so there's a variety of factors that are really stacking up against that population out there. But it could be precipitation. It could be, you know, that some of the development activity, you know, it could be predation. So it could be a whole variety of factors sort of contributing to that population and its status.
Thank you very much. I don't have any further questions.
Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Commissioner Gonzalez, for continuing to follow down the line of the timing of the variance process, because I don't think it was deliberation. I was trying to understand the timing of the variance process and to make sure that I understood how it worked functionally, operationally, so that I could make a determination whether the variance process seemed to make more sense than a suggested waiver process. But I think I understand now kind of the intent of the variance process, so I appreciate that. I did have a couple of questions and one of these is, I know that the gold medal fishing waters in other states, the blue medal or blue ribbon fishing waters, I mean, it's a specific designation. It has to do with, certain criteria in order to be designated that. I also know that there's a number of stretches of river within the state of Colorado that, while not formally designated gold medal waters, actually have the same quality of fishing and fish within those. Is that true? And then what is the process of being designated gold medal fishing waters?
Mr. Ackerman?
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And we actually do have some aquatics experts on the phone as well that'll be able to answer that better than I will. And so I believe we're attempting to elevate Josh Nearing.
Hello, Mr. Nearing. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Chairman, Commissioners. I think I heard the question. There was a little blink when I was getting moved over, but I think the question from Commissioner Gonzalez was it gold medal fisheries?
It was a question from Mr. Messner. Do you want to repeat your question?
Sure. I guess the gist of my question is, what's the criteria for becoming a gold medal fishing water? Because my understanding is that there's a number of different stretches of river throughout the state of Colorado that really are gold medal waters, but don't have that formal classification. And we're throwing around different buffer designations based on the, we're not, but there have been testimony around certain buffers around gold medal fishing or blue ribbon fishing, which is a specific designation. But I'm trying to understand the difference between these specific designations and other stretches of river in Colorado that probably are substantially equivalent to gold medal waters.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Commissioner Messner. Yes, we do have other gold medal waters across the state, or other waters that could qualify as gold medal. And the process for being considered gold medal has to meet a couple different criteria. They have to meet 60 pounds per acre of fish biomass and have, I believe, 12 trout per mile, 14 inches or greater. And so there's a process where we go and it has to meet that standard consistently. So for probably, there's nothing set in stone, but probably, 5, 6, 7 years, it's got to consistently meet that. So a lot of waters are up and down and in between there. We do have a couple waters, I think, that will soon be moving through the process to become gold medal. Staff makes that recommendation to the Wildlife Commission for them to be included as gold medal, and then they're approved by the commission and brought into that category. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I've got a couple other questions around compensatory mitigation and the effectiveness of it. And I apologize, Mr. Holst. I drank too much coffee and I had to step away for just a second while you were getting into some of this stuff in your presentation, your closing presentation. So I think I missed it if you had already said it, but there's a few questions around the effectiveness of compensatory mitigation when it came to big game migratory corridors, and if and how one would determine whether or not the compensatory mitigation in a big game corridor would be effective or not.
Mr. Holtz?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Messner, that's a great question. My simple answer would be it would be effective if the animals are still moving freely across the landscape and migrating as they normally would. You know, if we don't meet that standard, then we're not doing a very good job of sort of maintaining that migratory corridor. So that would be, you know, that would be the standard that I would look for. And that's kind of why we're looking, you know, to try and go for that density that we mentioned in 1202D. And if we have to, you know, steer facilities away from things like pinch points or stopover areas, you know, we could do that through the process I think that's outlined in this draft, and recommend that those facilities not be permitted in those specific locations if we know where they are.
And along those same lines, I mean, it is feasible to think that if it is determined that some of the compensatory mitigation projects were not effective, that we may look at limiting or eliminating the ability to permit in these big game corridors. Is that correct?
If we get to that point, yeah. I mean, I think fortunately in most of Colorado, where we have some of these large migrations, we're not at that point yet, but certainly, I mean, that's, you know, potentially in the future.
Okay, thanks for that. And then same question for the grouse compensatory mitigation effectiveness. And I can't remember if it was you or Mr. Elm that indicated that as far as reproducing lek habitats, that there's some challenges around compensatory mitigation and grouse. And so with that, you know, is it possible to consider that there may or may not be the ability to be able to permit, you know, in these grouse habitats if mitigation is not a possibility, because avoidance really becomes the only option in that situation?
Mr. Holtz?
I'm going to start, and then I might defer to, you know, we have our grouse researcher, Brett Walker, on the phone. He would be a good one to handle some of the more detailed aspects of what we can and can't do. But, you know, that is why we put LECs as 1202C habitats, because that is really the preferred management technique for those LEC habitat features, and and more importantly, I guess, the nesting habitat that is associated with that LEC. I mean, that's really, it's for both the strutting birds and for the nesting habitat that is really identified by that LEC location. And so, you know, we're hoping that we're not in a position to have to mitigate those because of how those are stated in the rules. The mitigation would apply to sort of the broader habitats that are identified in that 1202D for grouse.
Sure.
I mean, I'll let Brett Walker expand on that if he would like to, if he's been added to the panel.
Mr. Walker, you are a panelist. If you would like to unmute yourself.
Hi, I'm Brett Walker. Thank you, Chair Robinson and Commissioners. I apologize, I did not hear the question as I was transferring over and being added. Could you please repeat it?
Sure. Really, it's just around the effectiveness of compensatory mitigation with grouse, and you know, whether or not it's foreseeable to, I mean, really in the end, if the compensatory mitigation is not effective, and I think I'm hearing some testimony that grouse mitigation is challenging, that avoidance becomes the primary tool for minimizing and protecting the grouse species.
Thank you for the question, Commissioner. That is my understanding as well, based on everything I know about reclamation and what I've seen, particularly in areas with low precipitation. Reclamation success is often very low, and restoration of species of sagebrush in those dry areas like Wyoming big sagebrush can take 80 to 100 years. In contrast, in areas with high precipitation in some of our mountain populations, mountain big sagebrush can come back much more quickly, more in the order of 15 to 25 years. So In some areas with low precipitation, low reclamation success, yes, avoidance would probably be the preferred option if compensatory mitigation isn't possible.
Okay. Those are the questions I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Messner. Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Does anyone else want to continue on this way? Because I'm going to head down a little different path. Okay. I'm wondering if staff could talk about just a refresher of the annual report that we would be putting together for the fees, the mitigation plans, and what would be in the annual report, and if it will address maybe some of the concerns that we heard from one of the parties today.
Commissioner
Director Murphy.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the question, Commissioner. In hearing the dialogue about that between commissioners and parties today in particular, it made me think that we should suggest including language in the statement of basis and purpose that specifically calls out reporting back on compensatory mitigation fee spending and progress in particular. I think that given the changes to 904 that specifically call out reporting on wildlife, it's well within the regulatory language, and adding that color to the SBP will help keep us all on track, in my estimation, if that's amenable to the commissioners.
Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm wondering if staff could also talk a little bit about our relationship with the Colorado Natural Habitat Program, 1. 2, how it, based on the relationship that we have with this nonprofit, if there is kind of crossover and sharing of resources and information, and how we work together. And then number 3 would be, is it, I don't think it is, but so maybe I'm going to answer my own question. Would it be typical for us to rely on information from a nonprofit instead of another state or federal government as part of referring to their information or rules or databases? So I heard a lot of testimony about we should use their information. I think it's called Codex, if I'm understanding everything correctly. I'm also understanding that maybe Codex is not quite there yet, but I'm also curious to know, would it be, is it something that we would contemplate doing, partnering with a nonprofit or requiring folks to use information from a nonprofit as part of our regulatory process? Sorry, that's a multi-pronged question. So.
Director Murphy is smiling. I know she has an answer.
It might be almost as meandering, so forgive me that. So in my experience, COGCC has not historically partnered with or formally relied upon the information gathered, reported on, I'm not quite sure what the right verb is, from the Colorado Natural Heritage Program, CNHP. As a result of the work on this rulemaking in particular, and the stakeholder interest in and really elevating the opportunity to understand what CNHP does, I did have a call with Mr. Anderson, who gave us a public comment in, I guess it was October, which it feels like it was 6 months ago, but obviously it wasn't. It was probably 3 weeks ago. Talking about what it is that they do, how they do it, and what does that mean for COGCC's program. And in that conversation, I was encouraged to learn that they're putting together the Codex, which I understand to be kind of a mapping tool that displays information. And that tool, I think, is something that we can, as an organization, say, dear OGLAs, take a look at this, and what does it tell us about the on-site situation? I do have a couple of cautions about it, and those are mostly because it's still being finalized itself. I mean, one caution for me is, how do you access it? Is it truly a publicly available resource that anybody can get on? Is there going to be a paywall, which to me you would have to have because that's the way the world works, which has led to me having kind of a very, very high level conversation about if CPW is already working with the organization, do we look at how we can join in that support so that our team can take a look at that information, right? 2, like, what does the information actually show? And that for me would be appropriate to look at once it's finalized and out in the public. And then the third component of it, that's a finer line to walk, is my understanding is that a number of the components of Codex are also wildlife related. And it's very important to me that we don't create confusion about who we're consulting on wildlife, and that needs to be CPW. And so I kind of want to take a year to see what the system looks like, how it functions, what it shows, to help inform us before we formally or rigidly introduce that into a regulatory provision. And so, as I said, my answer is probably going to be fairly meandering or broad, but I think it's worth looking into. I would like to have CNHP and Mr. Anderson, or the right person, maybe Dr. Anderson, come give a presentation at least to our staff about what the tool is and what it can do and how it can help inform us. So again, it's a really long-winded answer.
Commissioner Mcgowan.
Commissioner Najapa, did you want to follow on this path? Because I have a different question.
I did. Yeah, I think it will be pretty quick. I did want to just quickly ask, Mr. Holtz referred to the Colorado Natural Areas Program, which, as I understand it, is a subset or a subdivision of CPW. I'm just curious how they interact with any of these rules, or how they fit in, if at all. But then also for Director Murphy, given what you just said, does it preclude us in any way from suggesting the use of CNHP in guidance to operators in terms of where they could find information about proposed locations, and what types of priority or potential species conflicts they might occur?
Director Murphy.
Thanks. I'm going to answer your very focused question first and then turn it over to John for a broader. I think that we can point to the CNHP database for operators and planning for development. With that, Mr. Holst.
Sure. With respect to the Natural Areas Program, Commissioner Najapa, thank you for that question. So, you'll note that we didn't include those as quote high priority habitats within the table, and that was purposeful, partly because we don't own those properties typically. We have agreements with private landowners on basically how they want to classify that as a natural area for the specific sensitive plants that are on those habitats. And we were very concerned that we might jeopardize those relationships with some of those landowners and that designation if we included it as an automatic consult. So that relationship with the landowners, where we have the Natural Areas Program agreements, is going to have to kind of be finessed in terms of prospective oil and gas developments. So that's I guess the answer to that question. If I might go back briefly to the Codex question, the wildlife information that CNHP has, frankly, is our data. We have a very close working relationship with CNHP. And the data kind of goes back and forth. With respect to the species that we regulate, we generally have their data and they generally have ours. What I would want to avoid, and I think what we'd all want to avoid, is a situation that we sort of ended up with House Bill 1298, where we have different sets of maps for the same thing, and folks are basically confused about which sets are regulatory and which sets are not. And so one of the struggles that we're going to have to sort of sort out going forward with Codex is, if that becomes an actual tool that does incorporate plants and things like that that might be useful for planning for operators, how we keep clear which species are regulatory and which might be used for planning purposes, and which maps essentially are the go-to maps for operators and the public.
Commissioner Mcgowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this might be a good segue. There was a lot of testimony about wanting a group put together maybe to explore biological resources and how they might get addressed. And I think maybe the data from the Colorado Natural Heritage Program could be maybe incorporated into that work. But I guess I would like staff's opinion about the idea of a biological resource group that looks at some of these issues and makes recommendations.
Director Murphy?
Thank you. I think I have a, I think it's complicated. I mean, trying to understand, having a more defined goal would be helpful for me to figure out how to accomplish it. I mean, I think biological resources are a pretty broad topic, and are there like particular areas where we should really dig in? Should we undertake a review of what our current reclamation rules require when we look at kind of that long-term impact versus kind of the short-term disturbance of an oil and gas location? I think that there could be some exploration of it, but it's a really big topic, and making sure we have a focused question to be able to provide focused feedback would make it more successful.
Commissioner Mcgowan?
And other commissioners might have some opinion about that, but I realize we have lots of rules that throughout the series that will be protective and help through with biological resources. But for me, I do think that some of those endangered or threatened plant species, maybe we're not really addressing, and I'm not sure that it's CPW's swim lane, and it's not clear to me how that fits in. But at the same time, Senate Bill 181 does reference biological resources kind of as a bigger overall umbrella, I think. And so one of the things, I guess, for me that might be interesting or helpful to look at would be how to address certain plant species.
Commissioner Nanjapa or Director Murphy? Director Murphy, did you want to respond?
I think if we get a pretty focused direction from the commissioners on this, yes, we can totally take a look at it, and that feels more tangible to me, Commissioner Mcgowan.
Commissioner Nanjapa?
Thank you. I'll save it for deliberation, but thank you.
To the wildlife folks, I might ask a question. We had heard from, I think in particular, the Western and Rural Local Government Coalition that, there are a lot of historic well locations, and there may be an idea that they would want to use a historic location for new wells, as opposed to making a new well pad with new access roads, et cetera. And I don't know how often that might happen or not, but is it true that that might be in certain instances, a better outcome for wildlife, even if you're maybe closer on a 1202C thing or critter, because they've kind of gotten used to it? And that seems to make some sense to me, but I am not a scientist at all. And I just wonder if you might opine about that. Commissioner, or Mr. Holst.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I would say it is a site-specific situation, but in general, probably yes. And I would say that from the standpoint of, in a lot of our Western habitats across the state, reclamation is not easy. And a lot of times it's done primarily for stormwater purposes, for Clean Water Act compliance, and it's not always the best wildlife habitat. So even if it's an old access route and an old well pad that has been reclaimed, it may not be reclaimed in a way that it's really productive wildlife habitat. And if that's the case, certainly I could see a situation where that would be a more beneficial spot to put a new location than basically disturbing new native habitat. But there are also situations where the opposite might be true. If there's a really good reclamation job and we've actually opened up some habitat that is uniformly been closed and needs that sort of a treatment, it could have been essentially it could have acted as a treatment on the landscape and actually improved the habitat conditions. So it could kind of go both ways. But in general, I would say the answer is probably yes. It would probably be beneficial to co-locate on an old pad, even if it had received reclamation. Just depends on the situation.
Thank you for that. And I appreciate that it would be site specific, just peering around the edges of some of the testimony we heard. Mr. Duranlo, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to note that, we may be talking about an existing active oil and gas location. We may be talking about a P&A well location, where they have commenced final reclamation. On the existing active location, there may be an area that's in interim reclamation that they might have to push back out, et cetera. So, again, just pointing to that, the site-specific determination. But I can say that if you look at our maps and you look at the mapped habitats, there are well spots square in the middle of some of those, greater sage grouse, what are now RSOs and would be NSOs, and they also may not be the best place to locate the next well.
Thank you for that. I've got a different question. And this just gets to that one, I think it was a commissioner, I can't remember, who spoke about potentially when you're doing compensatory mitigation that you would involve either the local governments or the conservation districts. Does that sound like a good idea to the panel that we've got before us? And if so, is that, maybe that's something we can sneak into the statement of basis and purpose, just as we have the opportunity. Director Murphy?
I think that's the right level, in that, yes, having input from local governments, districts is helpful to understand what else is going on in the area, but hitching our wagon to theirs across the state without kind of consideration to each of the unique districts or governments feels like less of a good idea to me. Again, I think considering their input and understanding what they want, yes, absolutely. And I think
so
the SBP.
Sneaking that into the SBP as a discretionary, not mandatory sort of thing might be supportable. Okay. Yeah. Other questions from commissioners? Well, I want to thank staff. I want to thank CPW staff. I agree, excellent summations and closings. And I think that this hour and a half that we spent in Q&A with you has really helped round out the notes for all 5 commissioners, all 7 commissioners, as we now can turn to deliberation. Don't go far. We may want you to come back as we think amongst ourselves about what is the next step for us, which is to provide or identify the issues, which seem to be self-evident at this point, and then provide some direction amongst ourselves to staff. We've been going at it about an hour and a half. Do you want to dive into that now? Do you want to take a short break? What are folks' short break? Okay, let's do a 7-minute break and come back at 3 o'clock. It's 2:53. All right. Hello, Director Murphy. Thank you for thinking ahead and putting a slide together to capture direction to staff from commissioners. I think we're at that point. It's 3 o'clock. And I think we need to do some iteration of what we've done in the past, which is define the issues and then see if we've got consensus on the direction we'd like to provide to staff with regard to the issues. Do you agree with that, Director Murphy, that makes sense on this 18-page rule series?
I do, Chair, and to that end, I went ahead and put together kind of an overview table of contents of the rules themselves to kind of help at least frame where we want to pull conversations in. And I broke out the subparts of 1202 just because I think those have received a lot of attention, in particular in terms of either what species are on particular lists or how those lists operate. So I'm happy to either kind of go commissioner cut by commissioner and build in different components within these different pieces, or if we want to jump right in with your first suggested issue, if that's the right course with commissioners, let's do that too.
Commissioners, do you have a preference in terms of how we go about issue identifying? Commissioner Nanjapa, I was hoping you were going to go first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm comfortable with however folks want to do it. I do have my notes kind of in order, so I could either go sort of section by section, or I could go through my whole list. Whatever you all prefer, but I'm prepared either way.
Why don't you take it away however you think it makes most sense, because I know that you have done your homework on this series, and it is within your wheelhouse, so we appreciate all of that.
All right, well, I'll take a stab, and I want to say, despite my own training, I think the questions and the discussions that we've had, with everyone here on the commission has been just excellent and really helpful for me as well. So just want to give some kudos to my fellow commissioners on this. It's a complex bit of info. So for me personally, I am comfortable with 304 as is. With 309, I had two possible points. One is whether we need to better address federal T&E species that do not have critical habitat designated. The other one is E5D3. And this is related to some of the requests that came up from, I think it was Western local governments, as well as Kinder Morgan. Their request was more specific to waiving requirements, but I want to just have a conversation about that. I'm thinking of a slightly different direction, but just some language that relates to requirements from federal agencies and when they either exceed or do not exceed our rules, how we handle those. For 1201, I'll wait till Director Murphy catches up. Okay. 1201, I'm generally comfortable with, but I'm not sure if it would be here or in the compensatory mitigation section about possibly including some monitoring or other reporting requirements. Okay. 1202. I wanted to just take another look at the hazing issue with birds, A8. and whether we could perhaps put in language that was more related to timing and exclusion. There was also someone else who brought up certain exclusion devices that exist for some of the various equipment, and so maybe we can just look at that a little bit. And then let's see here. And then the next big one, of course, is 1202C, and whether or not we keep it as is or look at some sort of additional waiver or exception. I know Chair Robbins, you mentioned this specifically as kind of the big one. I've got a potential proposal, but I'll wait. I'm just kind of putting the general issues on the table here. Let's see here. I think that's all I have in 1202. Yeah, I think that's right. Oh, sorry, 1202C. I also, well, yeah, whether or not the distances for the various species listed should remain as is, or if any should change.
Commissioner, is that specific to aquatics?
No, in general.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, that's kind of part of the whole sort of 1202C thing that I could, we could get into in more depth. And then let's see, then 1202.3, as I mentioned before, possibly adding some requirements for monitoring or evaluation. And then related to that, I'm wondering, it's maybe more related to guidance or the SBP, but perhaps if there could be a sort of a menu of projects or options when there were particular compensatory mitigation projects that an operator could contribute to. I would also like to talk a little bit about the fee, and I think there was some great information that Mr. Holtz had shared in terms of how it's calculated and how it kind of breaks down, but still something that I think is a little bit, it still feels a little bit low to me, especially now having heard a little bit more about when and how compensatory mitigation may or may not be effective.
Commissioner Njapa, did I miss one of your issues? I think I got the first one and then missed one and then put fee on there.
No, I think you, oh, I just mentioned about maybe in the guidance, whether there would be a menu of projects that could be offered to operators if there were either guidance or in the SBP, if there were, you know, maybe there's some something we can offer to operators that are interested in, rather than paying a fee, than contributing to a project. Yeah, and then the fee, whether or not it should, not so much the calculation, but whether or not it is sufficient for the fee. For definitions, just maybe clarifying the update schedule for the maps in high priority habitat. I don't have another in definitions. I appreciated the explanation on minimizing adverse impacts and how that related to the definition in statute. I think so. I'm comfortable there. And then in the SBP, I had a couple of things. I don't know if you want to have a separate SBP category, or I can put it. We can get to that later, but okay. So I think we would want to have some additional clarification about that definition of minimize adverse impacts, the one in the statute, and how or why we, chose to do that differently. I don't know if that's already in there. I may have missed it. I would like a little bit more clarity in the SBP about how other priority species for the state are being addressed through OGDP evaluations, and the potential for CPW to request consultation. A little bit more clarity on the reasoning behind the change from the 300-foot buffer. It seems like that was, continued to be an issue that was raised in comments. And so I think if we got a little bit more in depth on the explanation there, that could be useful. And then compensatory mitigation reporting and effectiveness, I think, was another thing. Reporting, monitoring, and effectiveness, sorry. So those are all kind of the overarching topics. And like I said, I can get into more detail when we all deliberate.
Thank you, Commissioner Nanjapa, for creating a mighty fine list there for us. Does someone desire to go next or add to? Commissioner Mcgowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would be interested in talking about whether or not we're adequately addressing biological resources and whether we should put a work group together and whether or not we could give it some focus, and maybe that would be in the statement basis and purpose. And I would be interested in the 1202 series of having the mosquito control to try to control West Nile virus supply to all pits, not just in high priority habitats. Otherwise, Commissioner Nanjapa covered everything I was contemplating.
Thank you. Commissioner Messner, Commissioner Gonzalez, do you have things you would like to add to our list for contemplation? Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to Commissioner Nanjapa for a very thorough issue identification list, and to Commissioner Mcgowan for her additions. I got a couple things that I think we should talk about, and perhaps get a little more feedback from staff on. One is kind of a small thing that was brought up in at least one piece of testimony that I found interesting and warranting of a question, which is the implications of wildlife escape ramps into trenches and the associated stormwater risks that were presented in that regard. I'd be curious if that's been accounted for in the rules as drafted. Let's see. I think the next one that I think I would request as potentially part of the SBP, or maybe even just for this discussion on Wednesday, is I'd like to see a mapped out process of a 1202C variance and what that would look like in coordination with an OGDP. I think that may be helpful to some of the concerned industry parties and their concerns with the efficiencies or the inefficiencies associated therewith, or at least perceived with a variance process over a waiver process. And I don't think I have anything additional to add for discussion, or for the discussion points that we've listed.
Mr. Messner, did you have anything that you wanted to add to the list, or are you comfortable?
No, I've got all kinds of stuff that I'm interested in talking about, but it is all captured in these categories. So
Great. Yeah, I think I'm in the same place as that. So, commissioners, is it best to start at the top and just roll our way through it? Or do we want to start with some of the more significant topics and see if we can get some consensus there? Do folks have a preference? Commissioner Messner.
I think we should just dive into the hard topics first. Because I do think that there's some low-hanging fruit, but I do think we need to sort out kind of these big picture things because they affect some of these other things. So.
May I be so bold as to suggest 1202C in line with that, Commissioner Messner?
Yeah, I think that's one of them.
Commissioner Nanjapa?
I was just agreeing that I think that's sounds like a good thing to dive into and try to see if we can hammer that out.
Commissioner Messner.
So if we want to start, I can just talk a little bit. I don't have a specific recommendation right now, but I think I can start the conversation at least as where my head has been going. And I change my mind about every 15 minutes on this one, so do understand that. But I actually think that staff's presentation reviewing the variance process and getting a little better feel for the timing of that variance process and the pre-consultation with CPW. I still think there's some sticking points in there that seems challenging in application, but at the same time, I certainly see it as a viable process for 1202C. And so in many ways, I'm comfortable with that. I mean, I do think that there's some challenges as far as throwing a variance process in a concurrent process as an OGDP and the amount of staff time and evaluation and effort by the operator to put an entire plan together without any assurance that a particular variance is going to be approved at all. And I do have some concerns that CPW may or may not have the appropriate amount of information necessary from the applicant in a pre-consultation phase to make an informed decision, thumbs up or thumbs down on a proposed variance. But nonetheless, I think these things can get worked out. I do think that it's possible to work it out. I do take to heart what Mr. Martin indicated, that a variance process may or may not be asking the right questions. And I think that's a fair point. I think a variance process can ask the right questions, and I think it depends on how we apply it. But I understand in the rules themselves, those are some challenging questions to ask. In lieu of a variance process, my only ideas are pretty big, which is to require an operator to provide, or to require an analysis be done by either CPW or an independent contractor that CPW hires at the operator's expense to do a full EA or NEPA style analysis, depending on what the request is, in order to be able to provide the information necessary to make a determination on whether or not it's appropriate to to make a determination what buffers are appropriate in that particular situation. understanding that buffers on a site-specific situation can go in a number of different directions. I think we've heard from a lot of different sources that certain BLM RMPs are suggesting up to half-mile buffers from certain stream bodies. I think we're hearing some protections around some sensitive species, sage grouse, could be 2 miles up to 4 miles in some instances. And so these individual site-specific analysis may actually be more burdensome than the actual rule should an operator choose to do that analysis. And that analysis may or may not be a very quick process. In order to do a proper analysis, depending on what the requested variance is or the situation analyzed, could be, a couple months, it could be 6 months, it could be a year in order to develop the appropriate amount of information in order to make a determination on that. I also think it's important to have public comment period during a waiver process like that. So that was the other end of the spectrum that I was going at. And as I chewed through that, I was like, well, the variance process sounds a lot better and easier to apply for sure. But in lieu of that, if we're looking at a waiver, that's where my head was going. So.
Thank you for those initial thoughts, Commissioner Messner. Commissioner Nanjapa?
Thanks. I think I saw Commissioner Gonzalez's hand go up first, so I'll let him go.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you, Commissioner Nanjapa. And thank you, Mr. Chair, no problems. So I've obviously been thinking about this whole waiver thing a lot. I had a lot of questions for staff. I think I said that I hadn't been walked off the cliff or walked back from the cliff when we heard about it during the initial presentation. The way I think about the waiver and the variance process initially, or the way I thought about it, was in this kind of sequential, independent process. Having heard from Mr. Geronimo, from Ms. Murphy today on the potential for a concurrent process, I am much less concerned about the inefficiencies that I believe to have been presented through the variance process versus the waiver process. And where I was coming from initially when kind of, this morning started was I was thinking about, if I have the choice between two processes that end in the same result, but one is more time consuming, more burdensome, I'm going to choose the other one. I'm going to choose the more efficient one. But I don't feel like they're that far apart at this point. When I think about the variance as described, and again, I look forward to seeing kind of the map of that process to really make sure that I'm on the right page of it. And so at this point, I'm not hung up on the waiver process as much as I previously was. And I think that I'm pretty close to being supportive of the variance process as it's been discussed this morning. And so that's kind of where I sit with 1202C on the waiver versus variance question. I will tell you that I am completely against a NEPA or EA style analysis on a site-by-site basis for under CPW, under a state regulation. There's substantial differences between the way the feds manage their leasing their minerals and the way a state organization might as well. Feds are done it by the district office. CPW and COGCC we're going to be doing it statewide. Feds are really only applying to anything that has a nexus to federal minerals or federal lands. Here again, we're applying blankets statewide. I just think that trying to take the square peg of a federal process and put it in the round hole of a state process, given the totality of what we've created through this state process and through this 1200 series rules thus far, I think is inappropriate. And so that's kind of my 2 cents on that particular matter. So just in terms of the waiver versus variance process, that's where I'm at. I have heard the concerns of industry. I have shared those concerns. I still share some of those concerns with regard to the inefficiencies, potential inefficiencies there with regard to the adversarial nature of a variance hearing versus a waiver. I fear that there is some lack of coordination associated with a variance versus a waiver. I don't find that a hearing, an adversarial hearing, would be the most cooperative of settings for finding the right place. But if all the legwork occurs leading up to that, I feel much better about the variance hearing or the variance avenue than the waiver avenue. So that's my 2 cents on the 1202C, and I'll pass along to the next commissioner or the next issue.
Commissioner Nanjapa, did you want to weigh in on this topic?
Yes, thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks both to Commissioners Gonzalez and Messner for those initial thoughts. I will just agree that, having that additional conversation that we had today on the variance process and, all of those sort of timing questions and everything was really helpful. And so generally, I'm also comfortable with leaving it. However, I know that there were a lot of different questions, especially with respect to the aquatic habitats and some of those things. First and foremost, I just appreciate all the comments, from staff and some of the other stakeholders that this 1202C section, and this is the way that I've been thinking of it as well, is about avoidance and protecting these sensitive habitats, these species, where we actually know that there's an impact and that we're trying to really protect them. And there's been all this talk about the greater sage grouse, and the reason that species is not listed is because there was a lot of effort to keep it off the list and a lot of money spent, which that was brought forward in the comments. And what we're doing here is preventative medicine, basically. We're helping to avoid all that additional money having to be spent and all those additional coordination and consultation if we can actually protect these habitats. And I was further just influenced by some of the testimony from the stakeholders about, especially, some of the big game species and their habitats and the inability to mitigate, and the LECs, et cetera, that we talked about. So, so all that said, I think at least for A through Q, I would be comfortable completely leaving it as it is. And the reason for Q is that it's a relatively small kind of area considered for the cutthroat, where there's still the variance process. What I have been thinking about and want to put on the table for discussion is for R&S, given that there was a lot of comments about reverting to 300, from the industry groups or going further from some of the other groups, I would say that we say that it's a 500-foot setback unless with a CPW pre-application consultation, a different distance would be approved. And in that case, it would sort of open up the operator to potentially a greater distance requirement, or, if they could sufficiently demonstrate that they would not harm the resource, that they could go less than 500. But what I've also been thinking of is no less than 300, given that that's been the standard that we've had for over 10 years, as so many people noted. And given that, there are these site-by-site considerations. So this is kind of where I'm generally thinking. Then any other exception or change that would be either a lesser distance or something else would have to go through the variance process. So this would be a sort of potentially upfront in that pre-application consultation, signed exception by CPW, specifically for R&S. And I'm thinking this would be then, applicable to the perennial, not just the intermittent and ephemeral. So that's my thought on that.
Julie's dog doesn't like that thought.
There's probably a lot of other people barking in the background too.
He really loves swimming.
Commissioner Mcgowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Commissioner Nanjapa, sorry, I think I need some clarification about what the current draft is, which I think is for R&S, there is an opportunity to get a waiver from CPW, but if it's related to an intermittent or ephemeral stream, and you're saying we would open that up to perennial also, closer to 500, but greater than 300, in between 3 and 5, so to speak, if CPW approves. Is that what you're saying? I'm just trying to make sure I understand.
So what I'm, if I may, Mr. Chair.
Yes, please.
So thank you, Commissioner McGowan. Yeah, so what I'm thinking of is more of if the operator seeks pre-consultation, pre-application consultation, for the purpose of an exception. I'm not sure exactly how this would be worded, to fit in, but I'm thinking that in that event, if they're seeking, basically they're requesting a site-specific evaluation for this purpose, that it would open it up, and then CPW might recommend a greater distance in that instance. So we wouldn't be limited to the 500 foot. Or they could create an exception, but it would have to be no less than 300 feet.
Commissioner McGowan?
I think I understand. Thanks.
Did you want to weigh in further, Commissioner McGowan, at this point, or were you just seeking clarification?
No, I want to see clarification. I think I'm in agreement with the other commissioners that I understand the process better now after kind of being walked through it. I personally think I would still be open to a waiver process, but that would be more rigorous than probably what a waiver process is envisioned by the requesters, which would be kind of a pre-approval from CPW that the waiver made sense, but then some sort of public comment period with the relevant local government. And I'm not sure how we would define public comment, but that might be onerous enough so that the operator wouldn't think that that was a better situation, and they'd prefer just to do the variance process anyway. So
I appreciate that. And I guess I can weigh in on this topic about variance waiver. I've appreciate what we heard from staff in terms of how it would happen. I do think that the variance rule 502 is flexible enough for the operator to do it as part of the OGDP. And I think if they're doing an early on consult with CPW and they know they've got CPW in their back pocket, then, it's not a problematic risk to process the rest of the OGDP. I think it also provides opportunities for operators to bundle locations and show us in one OGDP that's got several locations how a couple of the locations may be closer, but all in, this is a much better plan. And so I also look to the other, I think, nicely drafted work that was done by staff and CPW. And I don't know that some of the folks sort of recognized the off-ramps that already exist and that staff pointed out this morning, which allows me to be more comfortable with the variance, even though that's more onerous than just a categorical waiver. I also don't like the concept of categorical waiver because I don't know what that means. I don't know how we put parameters around that. But I just reiterate that there are off-ramps. There's the 309 E3B off-ramp, which I tend to look at as kind of a cap for wildlife. If they put together a wildlife plan that is for an area, you can get your pre-approvals and you won't have to do the consult. Similarly, 309 E3C, if the maps are wrong or the critters are gone or the area is no longer wildlife, that's an out. 309 F or 5, there's the waiver built in for intermittent and ephemeral streams. I think also there is an out in that we're going to be doing alternative location analysis. I mean, I think we're going to get some ground truthings outs when everybody gets out there on site and they try to figure out what's the high water mark. And, because if you're going to have a setback, whether it's 3 or 5, you got to figure that out, and that's on a case-by-case basis. So I think there's a lot there that makes this a very well-drafted, protective set of rules. And I think that using the variance as the out makes some sense. I went back and I read Rule 502, and Commissioner Gonzalez, I appreciate that you had looked at that as well, the C 1 through 5. I would, so, and let's go over those real quick because I think it's important. So the one is good faith effort to comply with specific requirements from which it seeks a variance. Number 2, the requested variance will not violate the intent of the act. That's good. 3, I'm going to skip 3. I'm going to go to 4. Granting the variance will result in no net adverse impact to wildlife resources. And then 5, the requested variance contains reasonable conditions of approval to avoid, minimize, or mitigate as against wildlife. So I think that's a well done set of things. The one I skipped and the one I would like to potentially ask AAG Davenport or AAG Minor about is number 3. And that is the requested variance is necessary to avoid an undue hardship. And I'm trying to figure out if that criteria makes sense when we're thinking about a 1202C variance. You know, and Commissioner Messner, I would look to you. You were a former county commissioner, and I know you've dealt with these kind of variance criteria as well. I've represented a lot of local governments over the years, and undue hardship, I think, in my mind, was when application of the specific rule just didn't make sense, given the, you know, how the lot was shaped. They couldn't meet a requirement, but it wasn't necessary either, and so it was not a fault of their own that rule couldn't be met, and that way the lot is not rendered, you know, undevelopable. And I know that's a land use oriented piece, and I would like to hear from the AAGs. And this gets back to my example about using an existing well for new wells. I think there's times when that could be better for wildlife, even if it is within a 1202C, but I don't know that you could perhaps meet the undue hardship there. And so I throw on the table, maybe we be creative and use the 502C 1 through 5 criteria, but not the undue hardship one. But I could be convinced otherwise if the AAGs want to weigh in on that. And again, Commissioner Messner, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that topic. AAG Davenport, and then Commissioner Messner, or backwards and forwards, I don't care.
Commissioner Messner, please go ahead.
No, AAG Davenport, why don't you give us your interpretation of undue hardship?
Well, I think undue hardship, it is something that it was discussed in the SPP as something that is potentially commonly understood in well-developed case laws, what the SPP says. I mean, in my view, undue hardship can mean a variety of different things, and the commission would need to look at that on a case-by-case basis to determine if undue hardship is met. Thinking through a wide variety of hypotheticals, there are times that an operator could meet undue hardship in the context of obtaining a variance from 1202C. I hesitate to give my own personal interpretation in the sense that I know that this is something the commission discussed at length, and I'm also cognizant of the fact that staff, this was part of the draft rules that staff worked on with the commission as well, but in my view, undue hardship would mean potentially, again, depending on the circumstances, something that is a hardship or a difficulty that it's unnecessary for an operator to go through and still meet the requirements of the rules and the remainder of the variance. And I think I'll leave it there. And Mr. AAG Minor, please chime in as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Mr. Davenport. I think the only thing I'll add is that, as Mr. Davenport noted, the discussion of undue hardship is on page 178 of the latest draft of the SPP, and it does indeed note that it's intended to have the same meaning that's understood from local government case law. That was a very sort of explicit direction that the commission gave during deliberations on the 500 series. I did personally review a lot of that case law. It seems like the vast majority of it comes up in the context of property tax assessment litigation. but there was indeed a fair amount of that came up in local government law in Colorado. And I would just add that if there's sort of a specific meaning that the commission intends for it to have in any given context, certainly that would be appropriate for the commission to add to the statement of basis and purpose, either for the 1200 series or for the 500 series, to reflect that specific intent in any given context.
Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So in my experience, I mean, the undue hardship thing is pretty standard in variance processes. And it's actually, while I think designed to make it a higher bar, I think in application is not a particularly difficult bar to meet. You know, I think that in this case, it becomes a little bit challenging because sometimes the undue hardship burden often is a financial consideration.
Mm-hmm.
This can't be a financial consideration, you know, in my opinion, based on our direction from SB 19181. And so that does put a little bit of a different twist on it, but I still don't think it's one that I don't think it's a, you know, an unclearable bar by any means. I just think it's explaining exactly why they can't meet the standard, what the challenge is, and why it's burdensome to try to meet that challenge or meet that standard, I mean.
Well, again, I can be, you know, convinced that as is, we can just use the 502 with all 5 criteria. It seemed that the other criteria are the ones that are kind of getting at the meat of when we would grant a variance, you know, not against the intent of the act, no net adverse impact to wildlife. The variance requested has reasonable COAs as to wildlife resources, et cetera. I just felt like those 4 really get to the meat of it. And I do want to create a process that is workable in the appropriate occasions. And I didn't want us running into something where someone throws out, that's not an undue hardship. And, you know, in fact, I looked at the statement of basis and purpose and it didn't really say much other than a reference to the case law. And I have not had a chance to go back and look at the case law. So I could still be influenced to just, you know, again, use the variance, but just use 1, 2, 4, and 5, because I think that gets to the meat of when we would be appropriately allowing for a variance in what is otherwise these no-go zones. Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I think you more artfully explore the concerns that I had for specifically the elements of showing for the 502 variance. I think the undue hardship is an important one that's going to be a challenge to adjudicate, and perhaps that should not be a part of a variance for 1202C. I would also throw out for consideration the and I don't have that rule pulled up in front of me, but the good faith effort to comply or inability to comply, I think could also, there's plenty of scenarios as discussed through testimony that could fall into that, where an operator may or may not be able to show that while still applying for a supported variance.
Yeah, Bill, Commissioner Gonzalez, you hit it on the head. I almost was going to go there as well, because, you know, I think that it's not that they can't comply, it's that under the other 3 things, we think it's better to not comply for whatever reason that may be. And so I would support that suggested edit to my proposal, that maybe it really is the 2, 4, and 5, which is really getting to the heart of it. And I still think that gives us sufficient ability to say no, or CPW sufficient ability to say no. And, you know, as I'm looking at my notes, yeah, well, I'll stop there and see what other commissioners think. Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the sentiment and what we're trying to do here. I also think that for me, 1202C, you know, these are criteria or areas that we are first seeking to avoid. I mean, I think that, again, is the bottom line here. We need to avoid these areas. These are sensitive habitats. These are sensitive species. We need to avoid them. And so I'm a little uncomfortable going too far to make it easier to have applications interested in going into these areas because they're not hitting certain criteria within 502. And so I think it's important that they do make a showing well, the undue hardship thing, I can go either direction. To me, I mean, I don't think it's a difficult bar to be able to show undue hardship in a particular situation. You know, I can go either way there, but I do think, and some, I'm not looking at 502 right now. So what was the other one that you had mentioned, Commissioner Gonzalez?
I've got it in front of me, Commissioner Gonzalez, if you want me to read it.
Yeah, go ahead.
That the operator has made a good faith effort to comply or is unable to comply with the specific requirements contained in the rule from which it seeks a variance, including without limitations securing a waiver or an exception. So that actually doesn't. So it's just basically either a good faith effort to comply or not able to comply.
Right. And so to me, that's an important bar that has to apply to this, because if there's an opportunity to comply, and you know, I also appreciate the argument that says, well, in certain situations, if there's an existing pad and, you know, outside of 500 feet, there's, you know, native ground that could be utilized. But I think in a argument of not being able to comply, could you not say that the reason that you're not able to comply is you don't want to disturb this undisturbed ground at 505 feet versus this disturbed ground at 395 feet. To me, that's a compelling argument. I would, you know, I would be able to do that. I think that meets that standard of not being able to comply, but that's just me.
Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, no, I really appreciate all of this discussion. And, you know, as I said at the outset of my proposal, I do support this, you know, this rule as is with the variance process. The one thing that I was trying to do in part with RNS is maintain a minimum buffer so that you can't go within 300 feet. Because I think with the variance process, in theory, you know, anything could be suggested. So, I mean, I suppose you could leave that could still be placed there, and it would be up to us to decide whether that would be appropriate. I do also, you know, appreciate and support the notion that came up about these, you know, existing well pads and using those in favor of breaking, you know, native ground. But yeah, I mean, so I guess that's one thing that I want to think about with these aquatic habitats, in part because there's just you know, it's a larger, it's a broader chunk of area to consider. I know that it's relatively not, you know, as large in terms of the relative squares on the map that Director Murphy had put up, but there's more potential area there. Some of it may be eliminated with the intermittent or ephemeral, but we also know that some of that intermittent habitat is pretty important. And so, you know, can we at least then further sort of maintain that avoidance by creating a little bit of flexibility, but also some rigidity within RNS, if that makes any sense?
Well, unless others want to speak, I guess I can speak to the distances, because I mean, it's kind of two things, and they're kind of interrelated and kind of not, because depending upon where we land on distances, I think is indicative of the process for the variance. And I guess on the aquatic ones, you know, I tend to land that we should go back to 300 for native fish and sport fish. I tend to think that we should leave the 500 for cutthroat and perhaps for gold medal waters. And my thoughts on this are, we got a lot of arguments that the data does not support the 500 as a strict rule for everything. I also think that the areas that I'm suggesting recognize the need that the maps may not be accurate and that we need some ground truthing. I like the fact that industry recognized and everyone recognized when we inquired of them that when that ground truthing occurs, you may end up being required to go further. And so even if we revert back to 3 and 5, or 3 for native fish and sport fish, that doesn't mean that that's always going to be that. It could be further dependent upon the site-specific circumstances. And, you know, the other tools that continue to exist, the CPW timing steps, they're not off the table, and those can be site-specific again. I just, I think I like the more site-specific approach. And I think that there was a lot of concern that there wasn't this support in the data for the 500 broadly across the board. So that's my initial notions on the aquatic distances. Commissioner Nanjapa, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I, you know, I understand where you're going with that. I think there were two things that that I was thinking of in this, and that it came up both from Mr. Ackerman in the staff comments, but also Mr. Randall's comments, which is something that I had, that, you know, we are, when we were at 300, our mission was, you know, prevent and minimize. Now we're avoid, you know, minimize and mitigate. And there are, you know, beyond, as Mr. Ackerman said, you know, the data are, there is support for going beyond that. And it's, to me, it's a little bit like our conversations around the setbacks, around residences, et cetera, that there was a certain amount of data that was specific to public health. But there were other considerations, you know, welfare and safety and et cetera. And in this vein, the sport fish and the native fish and aquatic species, you know, there's foraging grounds for certain species. There's, you know, the other aquatic invertebrates, or, you know, other species that are using those other areas outside of that 300-foot range. And so, so anyway, I think I know what the argument was with respect to the specificity, but there are, you know, especially looking at that list of all the various aquatic species that are encompassed in the native fish and aquatic species, I think there's sufficient support for going beyond that 300-foot buffer in order to protect kind of the habitat more broadly from that avoidance perspective. So that's just my 2 cents on that.
And I appreciate that. I'm just going to suggest one thing. I also was impressed with the testimony from Audubon, I think it was Ms. Burke, about perhaps we should be looking at a riverscape as opposed to just from the edge to the edge. And I would suggest that irrespective of where we land today, that's something I would like to study. I'd like to study that with my fly rod in hand. No, I'm just kidding. But I think that, I mean, there just seemed to be some, I mean, that seemed reasonable to me as I watched her little thing, is that is the area where we need to be protective. And so I don't know how to, I don't know what that means. I would suggest, Commissioner Nanjapa, maybe you run that show for us but do a stakeholder about that. So that's down a rabbit hole, but it is something that I wanted to say. So others that would like to weigh in on the distances, Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the industry groups, as I'm reading their testimony over the weekend, you know, also indicated that the idea of a technical work group on that is a good idea, or a stakeholder group. And so I actually do support that. I also, like Commissioner Nanjapa, was was moved by Mr. Randall's testimony that did indicate clearly the shift in mission from what we were in before to where we're at now, and how that does apply to wildlife and the protection of wildlife. And so I think, as I was reviewing studies and reviewing the information that has been provided by parties, I actually saw a significant amount of evidence around bigger buffers than 500 feet, as much around that, not necessarily in ephemeral or intermittent streams, but certainly around perennial streams and native sport fish areas and gold medal waters and blue ribbon waters and cutthroat waters. And the reason that I asked the question earlier about the difference in designation between gold medal waters and some of the other waters throughout the state of Colorado is I do think we're probably a little behind in designating what is and is not gold medal waters, and that significant portions of our rivers are actually gold medal waters, or one or two fish shy of gold medal waters. And I think we need to be aware of that as we think about these things, because as we're looking at the evidence around gold medal waters, some of the information provided as far as what some of the federal agencies are doing around setbacks around gold medal waters is significantly more than 500 feet. And so I'm really comfortable with the 500 feet. I'm comfortable with them being able to have a variance with it, particularly in ephemeral and intermittent areas, having on the ground truthing from CPW and then having the variance process through 1202C. I don't feel like there's any need to look at less than that. And, I think that there's some compelling data that's been provided as far as looking at, larger setbacks in a lot of situations. So, but I can be all right with 500 feet. And I would suggest that we do a technical stakeholder group to look at, do we need to get more specific regionally and look at larger setbacks in certain areas, or smaller setbacks in certain areas if that seems appropriate as well. So, but I do believe the precautionary principle is appropriate here.
Thank you, Commissioner Messner. Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I am also supportive of a technical work group that I think for me, the end goal would be mapping out all the stream segments and identifying what I'm going to use the word, what grade they are and what an appropriate setback would be for them, because similar to pits and other things, not all streams are created equal, and they probably don't all need 500-foot setbacks. And to Commissioner Njapa's point, maybe some of them need greater than 500-foot setbacks. I mean, I think the ultimate goal would be for us to have a better mapping system that's more accurate and that is ground truth, so to speak. But in the interim, we have to have something in place that everybody works from. And so I guess I'm comfortable with the 500-foot with the variance request for now, with the goal of better mapping and individual segment mapping so that we know the setbacks are appropriate.
Thank you, Commissioner McGowan. Commissioner Nanjapa.
Just one more point on this, and I think as has been stated, there are some instances where these buffer distances are much greater for certain species or for the gold medal waters, as Commissioner Messner brought up. But I think the other point that I think Director Murphy mentioned in the staff presentation is that BLM is a multi-use agency, and some of the things that they are trying to achieve are very different. And nationally speaking, wildlife management is conferred to the state fish and wildlife agencies, and CPW has that ability to make those determinations in these pre-application consultations. as needed, but in the absence of that, that 500-foot setback, I think makes a lot of sense, and I think is supported. As I said, you know, it goes beyond just the specificity of riparian buffers. It goes to this, you know, the additional habitat that's provided for other priority species that use that area, not to mention floodplain, et cetera. So yeah, so I'm just generally saying I support that 500-foot buffer in general.
Other commissioners with thoughts on this topic? Commissioner Messner.
By this topic, do you mean 1202C in general?
Yeah.
Okay, I would like to indicate that I thought that the evidence that's been provided around increasing the buffer for the Gunnison sage grouse to be equal to the greater sage grouse made a lot of sense to me, and I would like to suggest that.
I agree. Commissioner Nanjapa?
I agree as well.
Commissioner McGowan's got a thumbs up. Commissioner Gonzalez, do you want to weigh in?
I just have a quick question. You know, I was curious about the difference between the Gunnison County protections and at 0.6 miles that were used to base the original setback off, and now the 1 mile is being proposed. What were the drivers for that 2/3 of a mile, and what's the driver for it no longer being inadequate?
I can share what I know, but you know, at least in Gunnison County, for over 20 years now, we've had protections in place for the Gunnison sage grouse in an attempt to maintain numbers to a level to keep it from being listed. And clearly and so I think the best available science at the time that some of those regulations were put into place, but some of those are 10, 15 years old right now, was 0.6 miles. I think the range, and I'm not an expert on this, so I mean, I'm maybe not saying completely accurate information, but I think some of the newer, I think we saw testimony, at least from the Gunnison County Commission or Gunnison County Attorney, who's been working on this since the beginning, that treating it as a greater sage grouse, particularly in a situation where it is actually now a listed species and we are continuing to see declining numbers, would seem to indicate that the buffers that are existing right now are not adequate to continue to maintain the necessary numbers to not only try to keep it to delisted, but potentially see it going from threatened to endangered. And so if anything, it may need more protections than the greater sage grouse, not less, is the compelling argument that I've heard.
I appreciate that, Commissioner Messner, and I appreciate some of the testimony we received on that matter. It doesn't seem to me as there's much difference between the grouses, if you will, in terms of the need for protection. I have no objections to expanding from a 0.6 to a 1 mile buffer for the Gunnison sage grouse. I would like to make a comment though, just kind of as we continue these deliberations. There was a comment that Commissioner Messner made, and it was based on a comment that Mr. Randall made in regards to, hey, our mission's changed, so our rules need to change. And I don't necessarily believe that just because our mission has changed, that necessarily made all the previous rules that were in place not protective enough. I think that that's the case in many instances, and that's why we're going through this rulemaking process. But I don't believe that just because we changed the mission that we need to change and increase protections solely on that basis. And so that this is a comment that I'd like to throw out there for as we continue with this deliberation.
I tend to agree with you, Commissioner Gonzalez. where should we go at this point?
Chair, if I may.
Yeah, Director Murphy.
Thanks. Well, I'm going to go ahead and summarize that we have a lot of ideas on the table. I think I heard quite a bit of commissioner support for at least including the change on the sage grouse, Gunnison sage grouse buffer from 6/10 of a mile to 1 mile for commissioners' consideration. Next, again, today isn't a final vote, right? It's staff direction. So I think that I understand that we should implement that and let it be a topic of discussion, both for parties in their final remarks and also for commissioners later this week. I don't want to curtail the dialogue at all if issues need to be continued to be discussed. But it seems that there's kind of more support than not for keeping the aquatics habitat buffer at 500 feet, recognizing that that's kind of a loose majority at best, right? But that's kind of where I've pinned it at this point. Not that any of the other topics have been categorically dismissed either. When it comes to 1202C and the waiver versus variance process, I think I've generally heard support for pursuing leaving it as a waiver, or sorry, as a variance process with some discussion about whether all of the 502 criteria apply or not. On that, I'm going to offer my 2 cents, which is, do we want to see how it's working before we try to fix it? Because I do think that with variances come a lot of case by case considerations, and on balance, if a location in an SO makes more sense, even though it's not the best thing for wildlife, that to me demonstrates a number of those criteria. But again, I'm pontificating now, which is a dangerous.
Yeah, I mean,
so
I sort of think
to recap where we are. That's where I've heard direction.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary. I just, as one commissioner, would like to think about the variance pieces. I still feel somewhat strongly that subparagraphs 1 and 3 are probably not necessary and not applicable, and would undo what we're trying to do, which is, in the right cases, we have an ability to vary application of 1202C. And that's just in those right cases. And there may not be many of them, I don't know. And I particularly would feel firm on that, just as one commissioner, if the majority is going to maintain the 500 feet. Because then I think we've created a situation where we may need to be using that more often. So that's just my 2 cents. And I guess, I don't know that we need to, I mean, I think we can provide this to staff. You can come back on Wednesday. We can, the parties have now heard us deliberate and debate about this, and you see us, and before we take a final vote, maybe we could get that 2 minutes each and see what they, see what we're hearing, as opposed to firming up stuff now, from my perspective. But I'm just one commissioner talking away. I'd love to hear from the others. Commissioner Gonzalez.
I concur with that approach.
Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Do we have that built in already into the agenda? For some reason, I'm just not finding my agenda at the moment, but is there a response period for the parties? Because I agree with what you just said.
Yeah, Director Murphy, Hearings Manager Larson.
Mr. Chair, this is Ms. Larson. Yes, there is the opportunity for parties to provide a 5-minute response to staff's rules.
Yeah, that is Thursday afternoon. I knew I wasn't making that up, and it's 5 minutes each, so that's even better. Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm certainly open to hearing folks continue to share thoughts on this. I'm always open to hearing feedback. I think my question would be, if we're going to turn the variance process into a waiver process, then we should just create a waiver process, because if we continue to, make the bar lower on it, then it's really just a de facto waiver process with a little more structure to it. And so I don't say that flippantly. I'm just saying that I do think that one of the reasons that we're utilizing a variance process is to make sure that we've got a strong bar there, because these are no surface occupancy areas for a reason. And I think we need to, if we're going to have no surface occupancy reason, we need to keep that bar high. Having said that, I'm happy to, continue to hear thoughts on it. And so if we want to leave it, with those out right now and let the parties provide their statements, I'm okay with that.
Thank you, Commissioner Messner. Commissioner McGowan, did you want to weigh in on kind of procedurally next steps, or Commissioner Nanjapa? I can't decide if that was a high or a wave or a I want to talk.
Go ahead, Commissioner McGowan.
No, I like the idea of us getting some feedback from folks. I think we're going to be successful the more transparent we are about things and including people in the decisions. And so as long as that's the direction that we're heading in, I think it will be protective of what we're trying to protect. I think if any operator has been listening to this conversation, they know that the 1202C areas are the ones that we are trying to protect the most, and the goal is avoidance. And if you're asking for whether it's a variance or a waiver, it's because you have a very unique circumstance that you find compelling to put in front of the commission, that you would find compelling to put in front of a local government, you would find compelling to put in front of CPW, you would feel would be compelling if it went to public comment. And I think that needs to be our goal.
I appreciate that, Commissioner McGowan. And Commissioner Messner, in response to your valid point, my idea of applying 3 of the 5 variance criteria was not really meant to water that down into a more waiver process. Instead, it was to focus in on the 3 criteria that make sense given this specific rule. And I agree with Commissioner McGowan that I like the variance process because we've already developed it and we know it's transparent and we know it's a hearing before us in consult with the OGDP. And I really appreciate the open, transparent nature of this, as opposed to if we try to cobble together something else, we may by accident not be as transparent as we want our rules to be as we go forward with these important topics. All right. I don't know that we need further discussion on this at this point. I kind of want to think through it outside of the day that we're having today, and we've got tomorrow. And I think, Director Murphy, you've got some direction for some subtle slight changes, but there's also, it appears, some consensus that a lot of the stuff as drafted is good. And I see that Commissioner Gibbs just showed up, and I don't know if that's because he wanted to say something or he just is visually checking in with us. So.
Yeah, I'm okay. I'm just going in back and forth with the family.
Got it. No problem. Good to see you. Thank you for being with us. Director Murphy, where do you want to have us go at this point?
I think I want to confirm that the only 2 distances proposed in 1202C for discussion were the aquatics layers and the Gunnison sage-grouse layer. I see largely nodding heads, and so I'm going to move in and say, should we talk about I'm going to go back to the master list, which I've of course forgotten between typing it up and now. And say, do we want to stay in 1202 and talk about A and B in particular? Those seem like fairly targeted questions. And I can actually put them on a larger screen so people can read it.
Before you do that,
Yeah.
Director Murphy, let me make a statement to the 99 parties that we still have here. You've heard deliberation from commissioners about waiver versus variance. You've heard discussion about distances, and you've heard discussion about the using the 502 variance, potentially not with all the criteria. And I think what you're hearing from commissioners is we're trying to balance what was some very distinct presentations. It would not be as helpful to me as one commissioner to have you come back and regurgitate what you've said 2 times now when you have your 5 minutes. I would appreciate, sort of you trying to do what we're doing, which is achieve the right balance for the state, at least for this next year as we implement this and work through it, and then we do our stakeholders. So I don't know what I'm trying to say here, but hopefully that resonates a little bit in terms of making Thursday afternoon 5-minute presentations more useful. Now you can go back, Director Murphy.
At the risk of surprising our team, I don't know if it would be helpful to hear from staff on the hazing, the trenching, and the West Nile question. And if so, I would probably, sorry, it's hard. I can't see everybody when I'm sharing screens very well, so I'm not quite sure who from the team might show up to talk about those things, but Lord knows it's not me. I don't know if Greg, you would be in a place to talk about the stormwater and trenching issue that I believe Crestone brought up, or Mr. Duranlo. And then either Mr. Holst or Mr. Ackerman to talk about hazing or not. Maybe that's Mr. Duranlo too.
Mr. Duranlo, you've been put on the spot.
Sure. Well, thank you, Director Murphy, and thanks for indulging us, Chairman Robbins. So, I listened to the testimony from Crestone regarding the trenches and the escape ramps and how they would potentially, cause a stormwater issue. And frankly, I was I was a little confused. I didn't understand the issue that was presented, because from my perspective, managing an open trench for an extended period of time would always make that trench susceptible to stormwater entering the trench. So I feel like the escape ramps, which would be, periodically placed to allow wildlife to get out of the trench, wouldn't change, stormwater run-on, if you will, to enter the trench along its, as a linear feature. If it's across the slope, that stormwater would run into the trench unless it was properly managed, through stormwater BMPs uphill of the trench, and the escape ramps shouldn't change that at all. So an open trench left open for a period of time, the operator needs to manage the stormwater that may enter that trench anyway, to make sure their trench walls are stable. So I feel that, I think the request was for a longer time period before those would have to be put into place. And I don't feel that that's appropriate or necessary, and doesn't represent the right trade-off for wildlife protection.
Mr. Duranlo, I believe that Mr. Stewart caveated his request with something in the SBP about making sure there's daily visits if he got his longer time. I assume that doesn't really add or change your mind, and I just want to get you on the record about that because you're the expert here.
So let me make sure that I understand. The daily visits would be for seeing whether or not there is wildlife entrapped in the trench?
I think so, yeah.
And so without wildlife escape ramps, what would you do in that case? Now you see that the wildlife is in the trench. I think the wildlife escape ramp should be in there. A daily visit then could encourage the wildlife to move one direction up the trench to find the escape ramp and get out.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Does Mr. Holtz desire to speak to some of these issues?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'll chat a little bit about the hazing issue, and I'll tag team that with Karen Voltura, who is our Southwest Region Energy Liaison. And so just to be clear, the intent of the hazing is to really try and, either disturb the ground prior to the nesting season so the birds don't nest there, and then frankly to monitor that disturbed ground until construction really begins to make sure that no birds nest there. Earlier in my career, and I think Karen can speak to this as well, as doing actual biological work as a consultant, I did, actually go out and do nest removal activities on rights of way and things like that. And I think there's different techniques used for sort of different facilities in terms of hazing. For linear rights of way, it actually does require that folks literally go out on the ground to make sure that birds aren't nesting there. And so you can either disturb the ground prior to the nesting season, or you can actually go out and literally on a weekly basis go out there and remove early nest material before the birds actually nest prior to actually an active nest being established. So there's different techniques available. I'll let Karen elaborate on that a little bit.
Thank you, John. So my name is Karen Voltura. I'm the energy liaison in the Southeast region. And I have done, like John, a lot of hazing. And the intention of this, to clarify some of the questions, is before nest establishment. And I think that's key, is that once it's an active nest, then sort of those restrictions on when they can go through is after those birds have fledged. So I think in most cases what we see, and this is not a new recommendation, is that most are going to go with the vegetation removal prior to the nesting season or afterwards. There are some opportunities for exclusion. We see these are very similar to the CDOT rules. So things that might have, under bridges, you might have a series of nests that if you remove them and then put up exclusions so the birds can't come back and nest, that gives you a better timeline to do the work without actually impacting these migratory nesting birds. Hazing is not easy. Like John said, it's time consuming. I see this really only where there's a short time period where there might be 1 or 2 weeks before they can actually get in for vegetation removal. And it is requiring kind of consistent going around and doing this daily. So it's a lot of time in terms of people on the ground, and it doesn't always work. Birds are not always cooperative. They sometimes find a way to sneak in, and then you still end up with those nest avoidance. So I think the hazing would be a very small number of cases, and we can clarify in the SBP that it is not actively nesting birds. It's meant to prevent nesting birds from establishing. And we do see in practice that the most of the cases are that, and they can also do nest clearance surveys. So if they're in that time period and they go through that area, and especially if it's a very small area, you can understand that there are no active nests, and then vegetation clearing can proceed as necessary. So hazing in and itself, I think, is going to be a small number because it's not easy, and like I said, very time consuming, but it is not intended for actively nesting birds that have eggs and chicks in the nest.
Thank you, Dr. Voltura. And I think we can probably add, as you suggested, some language to the SBP if that would be amenable for the commissioners. And the one other issue that is kind of on the slide is the West Nile virus requirement. And maybe Mr. Holtz, do you want to tag back in on that.
Sure, thanks, Director Murphy. So we have had a little discussion behind the scenes since that Ms. Mcgowan or Commissioner McGowan's question. So, you know, I think we would be supportive of some broader application to control West Nile for both, you know, obviously public health reasons and wildlife reasons. There is some caveats there, though. I think we probably need to look at that a little more closely and be careful with waterways and make sure that we are sort of keeping those treatment chemicals away from waterways so we don't have some unintended consequences. In addition to that, you know, the elevation limit for the mosquito that carries West Nile is 6,000 to 7,000 feet. So we could probably put some upper limits on where that is appropriate as well.
Thank you, Mr. Holtz, for that. Do commissioners have any follow-up feedback on these points? Commissioner McGowan.
I'm supportive of just kind of updating that West Nile piece to apply where it's appropriate and makes the most sense, but I think it should be broader than just high priority habitat. I think West Nile is an issue of statewide concern from a public health perspective. So anything we can do to play our part, I think, is a good idea.
I'm good with that. Others? Yep, that's good too, Director Murphy.
Great. I think we buttoned up 1202. Do we want to take up 309E and 1201?
Sure. Commissioner Nanjapa, do you want to lead on the discussion on 309E? You eloquently put it on the table.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I mean, I guess this is just an issue that I feel like we have a bit of a gap because of the way that it's written, sort of relying on only if, you know, you're within critical habitat, the locations within critical habitat that's been designated. I know there was well, I guess maybe I just need to make sure that, sorry. Okay. I think Mr. Holtz did mention that they are always looking for, CPW is always looking for T&E locations or locations that might overlap with the T&E species. I think the way that it's written, it limits it to just when there's critical habitat designated. And so maybe we just need to expand that language so that it is, you know, to better assess T&E species locations, or so, I don't know what the right language is, but that's the gist of what I was just trying to get at, is so that we're not just limiting it to when there's been critical habitat designated.
Others with thoughts on this? Are folks supportive of this? I'm not seeing unsupport, so I guess we're good here. Mr. Holtz, did you want to respond?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Nanjapa, I do think that that's a good idea. That I think the difficulty with this part of the rule is it essentially assumes that that is a mapped, you know, in order to be an automatic trigger, it needs to be mapped. And so that's why we went with mapped critical habitat. We could probably think of, you know, maybe mapped occupied habitat, but then we would probably want to go look at those layers to make sure that, again, they're informative and not more like general range type maps to trigger a consult. That's kind of why we went away from anything but mapped critical habitat. So if our folks know of those occurrences that are outside of map critical habitat, we can request a consult at that time when we see the permit come across. It doesn't necessarily help, operators plan without having a map, but I think we would really need to look into see what layers are potentially available if we're going to keep it in 309E in that context, because that is kind of the automatic trigger for consultation.
Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Holtz. I'm just wondering, I think this is kind of what you're getting at. So Fish and Wildlife Service, will map, currently occupied versus historic ranges. Could we use one of those, or could we use kind of the most recent status assessment, or, something like that? I'm just wondering if there's something there, or even just if it occurs within, again, I'm not sure if this is creating more burden, but, within areas that have been occupied within the last 2 decades, and knowing again that, sometimes an area that you think might not be occupied, when you go and do a site visit, it might be. So just trying to figure out how we handle that so that we're not inadvertently, causing additional harm to an already T&E species.
Commissioner Holst. Now you've been elevated.
Oh.
Mr. Holst.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Najapa, I guess, and this is for Director Murphy too, I might recommend that we maybe take the next half day or so to actually look into that in a little more detail. I do know that, like, for example, the occupied habitat layers for some of those species do vary quite a bit. And so I think it'd be useful for our staff, maybe just beyond me, to take a look at that in a little more detail to see if we can come back with something beyond just designated critical habitat, to see if that kind of meets the need there. Off the top of my head, I can't really think of what that would be, but I think if our staff can kind of get together over the next few hours, we might be able to come up with something.
Sounds good. Thank you, Mr. Holst. Director Murphy, or Commissioner Messner, please.
So I have a question about the next one. So, I mean, I think we're done with this one, right? But the E5D3, the rules I have don't have a D3, I don't think. Or am I missing something?
Commissioner Messner, my understanding of this one is a compilation of either West Slope Rural Local Governments, West Slope COGA, Kinder Morgan ask for an integration or consideration of federal decisions into a new 309E5D3. But if I've misstated that, Commissioner should certainly correct me.
Commissioner Nanjapa.
I think I was the one who brought this forward, and yeah, so it does not exist. You're correct, Commissioner Messner, but it was a proposal from some of the stakeholders. And okay, so I think what they were, a couple different proposals. There was one, a couple that were fairly similar that were basically to, for CPW to waive additional conditions based on the federal conditions of approval. And then I think it was TEP maybe that said to waive additional conditions, maybe if it was in excess of what our rules already provide. So if the federal guidelines were more than that. What I'm thinking here is maybe we would add language that accepts the requirements from federal agencies when they exceed ours, but that CPW may include additional COAs. And this kind of mirrors what we did in, I think it was the 300 series with maybe the concurrent or the sequential, or one of the two, how we dealt with the substantially similar information, but had the acknowledgement that we could request additional information. So that's kind of where my mind was going with this. I don't feel like we should waive automatically, again, with the knowledge that BLM and other federal landowners are multi-use, and that CPW is the actual wildlife authority here in Colorado. So
Sorry, I'm muted. Commissioner Gonzalez and then Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And no, I recall the language in several different pieces of testimony. And when I was reading it, what I was thinking about, and I was thinking about this during the testimony as well, is that I don't know how I feel about, you know, a full deference to the decisions made by the BLM, but I do support language in the rule or in the SBP that at least acknowledges coordination or consideration of the decisions that are being made. And it's similar to what we've put in the rules across the board when it comes to federal lands. So that's kind of where I sit on this particular issue.
Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I certainly don't have any problem with, you know, coordination and communication with federal agencies. I'm certainly also not interested in deference to federal agencies, but I do think that, you know, that consultation phase is certainly worthy, and if and can be utilized as part of decision making, but not in lieu of the state regulations as we're drafting here. So
Yeah, I think we're okay here. I think we've got enough with what we've done with the feds. I think we've got a lot in the SBP. So that's where I guess I would come down. Commissioner Nanjapa.
sorry, just a question. And I think I am agreeing if this is what you're saying, but so you're saying just that because we sort of will cover this already, or it's already covered in other areas of consultation, that this would just be something we add in the SBP? Is that what you're saying? That we would accept those kinds of federal requirements, especially if they exceed our own?
I mean, I think we're good. I don't know about the rest of you, but where we're at now, I think is a good place to be. And I don't think we need to do anything more. Director Murphy, did you want to weigh in with your thought?
Thank you, Chair. I think that as drafted, we have the flexibility to look to the federal COAs in this circumstance, right? And if they're substantially equivalent, they can stand in. And I think that it's really important to understand the federal decision-making process and integrate that into our consideration while leaving CPW intact to make wildlife-specific recommendations. And so that's why I've really, I guess, been pretty strongly advocating that we leave 300 to define out how we integrate those federal decision documents and processes, and let 1200 really drive our relationship with CPW, because it's hard to see it in practice, but having been through some permitting with the agency, I think that the way we structured it gets us there. And there are specific call outs to deferring first to federal conditions of approval, which I think is really appropriate in this circumstance if they meet or exceed our needs. And if they don't get us there, then we would look to impose our own. So does that help, Commissioner? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
With that, I mean, I'm certainly in the mode right now, just kind of like powering through all this. So slow me down if I'm getting carried away here.
Go for it.
But that, to me, if we then turn to, I think we've talked through the 309E issues we identified initially, leaving only the 1201 wildlife planning question, which I put on its own slide just to kind of keep us organized and keep this stuff kind of legible, because it goes to a tiny, tiny font very quickly. And then I see people leaning forward, trying to read what I'm writing. So.
Commissioner Nanjapa, did you want to lead here?
Sure. I'll just note that that it came up. I'm trying to remember who it was exactly that a couple of the stakeholders I think brought up this idea of monitoring following compensatory mitigation and or other reporting requirements on kind of what was done and that type of thing. And so I do think that's useful. I'm not exactly sure kind of how that all fits in and kind of the lifetime of when this occurs with respect to the development of the actual location. So maybe I need to get a little bit of clarification there, but I do think there's some value there in just ensuring that the compensatory mitigation is done properly. And I just wasn't sure if we had that clearly articulated elsewhere.
Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Najapa, do you think this ties into, I think, earlier discussion around some transparency about how the mitigation fees have been used, whether compensation plans, mitigation plans had been successful, and wrapping that into the annual report related to cumulative impacts and CIDR, or is this different?
Thank you, Commissioner McGowan. I think it is related. I was thinking of it especially just from ensuring that what was said was going to be done was done appropriately, just for that particular site. But I agree that it does feed in as well to the kind of overall cumulative impacts as well. And again, I don't know if this is already covered with, other reclamation or other pieces of our rules.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Commissioner Najapa. And I'll piggyback on that because I'm kind of reading through the rules as you're talking about that. And I'm looking specifically at the compensatory mitigation plans. And one of the elements of that is mitigation work schedule and plan, and then monitoring and reporting requirements as you would set out in that compensatory mitigation plan. If I'm looking at that correctly, I see Director Murphy flipping through her notes, so hopefully she'll catch me if I'm wrong. But I'm curious, is that compensatory mitigation plan going to the concern that you're sharing, Commissioner Najapa, and given the kind of the tailored nature of these plans with a mitigation schedule and then reporting and monitoring requirements in that plan, does that satisfy the concern that we're talking about here? I want to make sure I'm on the same page.
Commissioner Najapa.
Thank you, Commissioner Gonzalez. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just looking back at that. I remember I saw that it was in there, but trying to remember now what was the issue that was also raised. I think for me, part of it was how we maybe just trying to get a better understanding of how we take that information, the monitoring and the reporting, that they provide to us in their compensatory mitigation plan, and do we, what are our steps for ensuring that what was done, was done properly, and that type of thing. And how does it, I guess, in relation to Commissioner McGowan's question, how does it feed into CIDR?
If I may, Chair.
Director Murphy.
Thanks. So Commissioner Najapa, I think that as it would relate to any plan, whether it's a wildlife plan, compensatory mitigation plan, there will be certain parameters that set out what our compliance expectations are. And our team is working every day across a number of different individuals to verify compliance. And so I think that this to me goes into that bucket. That's why we have field inspectors. That's why we have folks on the ground monitoring it when you're talking about, the specific compliance with a specific plan. Whether it's the wildlife, again, whether it's a wildlife plan or the compensatory mitigation plan. The broader question of what do we integrate into CIDR? And for me, what we have recommended and the commission has preliminarily approved as it relates to CIDR is impacts in high priority habitat in particular. And then I'd have to go refresh my memory on the other components. And that is a specific data insider that would be reported out. I think today we have had the conversation that we want to have a broader report out about the compensatory mitigation fee, how it's being spent, where it's being spent, et cetera. And so I think that will be reflected in the statement of basis and purpose as part of the 904A reporting. So I think that we're getting at some of the pieces of your question, at least. If not, though I would acknowledge it, I think that there's kind of this bigger one left on the table of if an operator is performing compensatory mitigation, is that being reported on? And I might need a little bit of time to work with our team on that, because I think it would, presumably some component of that would come into CIDR. So I don't know, if that's worth exploring, I would need a little more time to think it through.
Yeah, thank you, Director Murphy. I think it is, we're just looking at both the rule language and the SBP as you were talking there. I think maybe just a little bit more explanation as to those pieces, how it's going to be used, how it feeds into CIDR, and the amount collected and spent and that type of thing. I just had another thought and it just escaped my brain. It was also related to, there was also the comment from stakeholders about whether or not the aim is for net gain versus kind of an even sort of acreage, restoration versus, what was developed. And I think if we could have some additional clarification, at least in the SBP on that in terms of the intent, I think that would be useful and would advocate for a net gain.
Commissioner Najapa, I think that our rules are structured to be a no net loss. And I think that's kind of consistent with the minimize. That being said, I think that there are times when an operator's plan or proposal does end up with a net benefit. And I think we have heard some of those specific projects flagged as part of this process. And I think that we would clearly encourage and support anything that goes above and beyond for all of the reasons, kind of hearkening back to Mr. Ackerman's comment that people love wildlife, right? And so that is a good goal. We tend to be really focused on it. And so I think we should encourage language in the SPP, or include language in the SPP that we would encourage in that game.
Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Commissioner Nanjapa, for that discussion. Now, I think the compensatory mitigation piece of anything in these rules is the element that I think has the most potential. It's also the element that makes me the most concerned. I don't love compensatory mitigation. To me, as a previous county commissioner, it sounds a lot like payment in lieu when we talk about affordable housing projects or things like that. And those can sometimes work well. I've also seen tons of circumstances where it's actually, we're creating a worse situation by the payment in lieu than if we did nothing at all. And so I do think, an analysis and reporting about the effectiveness of the mitigation so that future decisions, not just from this commission, but also for CPW, can be informed, particularly in situations like big game migratory corridors where you may have situations where there's a compensatory mitigation, but we've heard testimony indicating already that, mitigation in big game and big game corridors has not been particularly successful. And so, if we determine, over time based on, whatever data that we collect, that the mitigation projects are not having at a minimum a no net loss, then, I think that informs our decision making around, what we permit or don't permit in migratory corridors. And, it may end up being that the only option there is avoidance versus a compensatory mitigation piece. And I certainly don't want to see these things default to compensatory mitigations, if there are other ways of approaching it, particularly in avoidance first. And so I think, having that analysis of the effectiveness of the mitigation and some sort of reporting on it over some period of time to help inform decision making in the future makes a lot of sense to me.
Commissioner Nanjapa.
Sorry, just to respond. Thank you, Commissioner Messner. I think, yeah, no, I think all that makes sense. And just to clarify too, I think when we were bringing this up, or when I was bringing this up, I said it might be here or in 1203. As I'm looking at this, it's probably better fit in 1203, all this SBP explanation that we're talking about. And yeah, I agree with what Commissioner Messner said with respect to, this helping to this reporting and efficacy documentation, helping to better inform any future projects. And you all heard me asking a whole bunch of compensatory mitigation questions earlier on, but I obviously didn't seek to add that into the rules that we've discussed so far, because I have seen that in many of these instances, this is really, yeah, what we'd rather not do if we can help it. And then the last thing along these lines, which I don't know if is here, or maybe if you already have in a different slide on 1203, Director Murphy, was about adding some potential, like a potential list or menu of projects that maybe CPW is already interested in that operators could contribute toward, versus just that sort of pay in lieu of concept.
Sorry, Commissioner Najapa, I lost track because I thought I deleted this slide and was kind of panicking a little bit, thinking I'd lost all of you all's work product. So I'm going to duplicate the slide a couple of times. And then we can kind of jump into this 1203 conversation. So,
okay. FYI, my computer's trying to update, so if you lose me, y'all have fun.
We can hear you, but you're frozen on the screen.
okay. So I think I'm organized to talk about 1203 now. And I'm just putting a note in the SBP section to make sure we connect the dots with the conversation we just had around 1201, if that helps. And then my dog is barking for the 472nd time today. And I also got a really nice reminder to save the PowerPoint document. So if you'll give me just a minute, I'll get that saved too. Okay, I'm ready. I'm really ready this time.
I think we lost Chair Robbins, or at least I don't see him on my screen. I will nominate Commissioner Messner as the commission expert on proceedings to lead us forward.
I decline.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Commissioner Najaba.
I think I at least am feeling good with what we already discussed in that 1201 slide and fitting it into this piece, other than the fee. Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just maybe just more than anything, just kick that back to staff to take another look, to think about the types of projects that could be beneficial and whether we have an opportunity. I think it might have been Commissioner Mcgowan had suggested maybe like a per acre, fee as opposed to these blocks that we have currently identified. And, just make sure that we're not sort of short shrifting ourselves, knowing that there are going to be some operators that want to directly pay into a project, but there's going to be a lot that if this is an option for them, they would pay the fee, and just want to make sure that we're covering ourselves well.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you. No, I appreciate I appreciate this point, and I heard it a number of times in the questions throughout the testimony, and I do think that it's very important that we make sure that the fees are sufficient, that they do go to the goal of ensuring that the mitigation is going to be meaningful with the use of that fee. And the only thing I would caution in the discussion, the consideration, is that this fee, in my opinion, should not be construed as a punitive measure by any means, or even, you know, in some cases, a deterrence measure. I think that we'd like to see the projects get done, and there will be ample consultation with CPW and with COGCC in that regard. And so I just want to caution that as we think about a fee structure and what is sufficient, that we don't venture into the realm of a punitive fee.
Actually, I think that's a fair point, Commissioner Gonzalez, because I do think two things, because I agree with Commissioner Najapa that maybe, I know that the staff looked at this and it's probably appropriate, but I mean, in my mind, I think looking at it as a payment in lieu, which means, is this the amount of money necessary in order to create a no net loss at a minimum? And if that's not the amount, as we look at it 2 years from now, we're going to get ourselves in a situation where potentially we've got, you know, a handful of compensatory mitigation projects that have been done, and then the analysis determines that we're actually at a loss instead of a no net loss, and that would be an unfortunate situation, I think. So,
Commissioner Mcgowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As part of this taking a second look, I would be interested to know what the mitigation fee change would happen if the two areas that staff said they took out of the calculations, I think it was Pickens County and can't remember the other. I'd like to know what that brings the average acreage up to for if they were included in that calculation that staff used to come up with the mitigation fee.
Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, along those lines, I think, you know, when I had discussions with staff prior to the hearings, I asked about, you know, projects that might involve, you know, larger construction type efforts, or, you know, like a road crossing structure, a stream crossing structure, you know, those kinds of things that would help to compensate for the roads that we're going in, or the, you know, et cetera, those kinds of things. And I want to make sure that those types of activities are also included in the assessment, you know, knowing that those may be not as frequent, but I think are important in certain aspects of, or certain parts of the landscape where we might, you know, need to think about that type of mitigation, and if we're doing it ourselves. The other thing, two other things in the public comment, I think there was somebody who owned a construction company, I believe, and commented similarly that the construction, you know, the cost seemed low as it related to construction. And then another stakeholder had mentioned about the, I can't remember how it was worded, but something about compensating for past poor performance. So in other words, in those instances where there's been reclamation, but it hasn't been done well, perhaps there's an opportunity to kind of redo some of those, and that might be some of the options we provide to operators as projects. But some of those may involve moving earth and might be more expensive. And so perhaps the alternate to contributing to a project would be a certain higher fee in some of those instances, depending on the situation.
Other commissioners desiring to weigh in? Director Murphy?
Yes, sir. Should we move on?
I think so.
So I think we're into just the definitions and SBP clarifications. I think if commissioners want to talk in detail about the SBP clarifications, they can. Otherwise, I think we can move forward and implement those. And on the, so I don't want to short circuit conversation about that at all. And with that, but to me, the last thing to discuss is the update schedule for high priority habitat maps.
Do commissioners desire to discuss anything further under the SBP? I think we're turning to the HPH maps updates. Commissioner Nanjapa?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think Commissioner Messner, I think, had asked about whether CPW would be able to do these on a certain specified date. I believe, I think that was you, Commissioner Messner, but I think we also heard that because CPW is updating their own internal maps fairly regularly, that it wouldn't be a major lift. So I would propose that we add in, assuming that we stay in January 15th as the effective date of these rules, each January 15th that the maps get updated. So that's my suggestion for discussion.
Commissioner Nanjapa, I appreciate that. Do we want to hear from anyone from CPW about that, or have we already and I missed it?
Chair, it sounds like January could work for CPW, although I would invite Brett to jump in, or sorry, Mr. Ackerman to jump in too.
It looks like we've got Holstan, Ackerman. If either of you want to weigh in, now's your opportunity. Mr. Ackerman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and appreciate the question. And not much to add to what Director Murphy said. In the end, we've been doing some surveying of our folks, and no objection to January 15th. We think that that would be workable. Our GIS folks think that would be workable. There are various nuances to the discussion, and like I mentioned early on, some of these maps are updated on a more frequent basis than others, but an annual update would be fruitful in updating the maps.
Great, and I think it sends the right message to our stakeholders and to our constituents that we will strive to do that on an annual basis. Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One point of clarification on there. What happens to OGDPs that are in process when the map changes?
Director Murphy or AAG Minor?
Great.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I can answer that question, and I had actually popped up to make a friendly suggestion. So maybe I will do that first and then answer the question, which is just that I believe if the Commission's intent is to simultaneously update the high priority habitat maps and the disproportionately impacted community maps, the data for the disproportionately impacted community maps comes from the Census Bureau, and the US Census Bureau releases those updates in mid-December each year. The Administrative Procedure Act does require a 20-day period between when notice is issued and when a rulemaking occurs. So it might be a little tight and challenging to get that done by January 15th every year. I think the end of January or early February should provide sufficient time for notice if the intent is to simultaneously update both the higher priority habitat maps and the disproportionately impacted community maps. And
would February 15th work better, AAG Minor?
It would, yeah, or yes, it would.
Commissioner Nanjapa?
Thank you. I don't know. Maybe I don't know if my comment is going to make any sense. But I'm wondering if we even need this in the rules. But if notice would go out by January 15th, could that be possible? And then we can set the hearing for whenever after that. But at least that way on an annual basis, be prepared for noticing the hearing. And then I don't know if that makes sense, but.
AAG Minor, Director Murphy.
Chair, that would have been my suggestion. So I
Great.
fully support it.
Mr. Chair, I'm happy to answer Commissioner Gonzalez's question as well, or AAG Davenport or AAG Stafford can, in terms of applications that are in process at the time of the rulemaking update. The APA provision that governs applications in process would apply in each of those situations. You may recall during the 200 through 600 series, you all deliberated about whether the regulatory changes met the Administrative Procedure Act's requirements for permits in process that would allow the new rules to apply to those permits in process. It's a fairly detailed four-part finding about whether the rules are necessary to protect public health, whether they're necessary to protect public safety, whether they're necessary to comply with state statute, and whether they're necessary to comply with federal statute. So that's sort of what's the status of permits in process would have to be determined by the Commission on a case-by-case basis in each of those MAP rulemakings according to the Administrative Procedure Act. So I don't know if Mr. Davenport or Ms. Stafford has anything to add to that, but that's sort of the state of the law on that question.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Minor. And I vaguely remember some of that. I don't remember all the details, so I appreciate the refresher on that. My question would be then, my concern with the maps themselves and just and the way they would come through in a rulemaking is they don't provide the same kind of notice that we've kind of alluded to that has been provided throughout this entire process, where we're changing things up and operators are kind of on notice that, hey, this is going to change. I'd have more concerns with someone being outside of a high priority habitat, working through the consultation or working through kind of their entire plan based on that buffer and then that changing midstream. And so I'm kind of just curious about if there'd be any leeway for specifically with the updates of the high priority habitats, with, I don't know, maybe delaying the implementation of that as to in-process applications. And I know it's a question not for the staff, but for my fellow commissioners to consider, and perhaps something to consider as we think about the application of this, I guess, of the updates on an annual basis on January 15th.
Commissioner Mcgowan.
Sorry, I'm not sure I understand, Commissioner Gonzalez, your proposal.
Commissioner Gonzalez, would you like to repeat?
I will do my best to repeat in a better way. And so I think what I'm trying to say is that my proposal would be that we update the maps annually and that the updated maps do not apply to in-process OGDPs.
Commissioner Mcgowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Gonzalez, would you be open to, that would be our general principle unless there was a compelling argument from CPW about why it would not be appropriate to kind of grandfather them in under the existing map?
I would be, and I don't know where that would be captured, but I think it may be captured under one of the director or commission criteria that if there's an immediate threat or a threat to public health, in this case wildlife, that the application of that map or the application of whatever that data is, or COAs, or whatever kind of stop work or whatever that ends up being, that we are still within our authority to exercise such a to exercise such a decision, if you will. I'm struggling with my words here late in the day, but I hope you understand what I'm saying.
Commissioner Mcgowan, and then Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, so yeah, I was also thinking this would be like probably a really rare situation, right? But if we discovered a species went from not being listed to now it's listed, and under the old map, we're allowing development, we're more concerned about the habitat because something significant changed, I would want us to have a discussion about that. But otherwise, I think I'm okay grandfathering in for consistency's sake for an operator, not having things switch all the time in the middle of an application.
AAG Davenport, would you like to bring perspective on this?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The only perspective that I'd bring is the commission can't necessarily make determinations for future rulemakings as to how those rulemakings or those potential future rules would apply to permit applications in the queue at the time. I don't know, Commissioner Gonzalez, if that is what you were really suggesting, but it is a principle that I wanted to alert the commission to as you discuss this particular issue.
Thank you for that clarification. Commissioner Gonzalez?
Yeah, thank you, AG Davenport. No, and that makes perfect sense. Then I would suggest that during the rulemaking for the update for the map, which I understand will, that's the notice that will occur when the new maps come out, that we can consider at that point, and we'll revisit it then.
Thank you. Thank you for the discussion. I think that was worthy. And thank you, AG Davenport, for remaining on your toes this late in the day. Other questions, thoughts, comments from commissioners? Director Murphy?
Chair, I think we have exhausted the list of identified issues. I think staff has direction and mostly has a lot of work to do on the statement of basis and purpose and thinking about some of these bigger picture work group concepts. And we can, while I think, and as I think forward to the rest of the week, right now we're scheduled for, I think, a 1 o'clock staff presentation on Wednesday. My suggestion is that we can probably turn around the rule revisions more quickly than that and get those out to you and the parties. But I would like that additional time to work through some of the statement of basis purpose language so that we can come to you and have that more robust conversation on Wednesday. And so my suggestion would be we keep Wednesday. We'll get rule changes out to parties just as quickly as we can. And I think they will have listened to the dialogue today, and that will inform their ability to prepare for their final remarks on Thursday. And with that, I'm happy to talk more about process or issues, or let us all go on our merry way this evening.
Thank you, Director Murphy. So thank you for that. And for commissioners and for our audience, we are concluded with the agenda for today. We've provided direction to staff. As Director Murphy indicated, we will be looking for a motion to adjourn until Wednesday, November 18th at 1 p.m. We will hear from staff that afternoon on the revised 1200 series rules, and then we will adjourn. And then we will reconvene on Thursday, November 19th at 1 p.m. And that's to allow each party 5 minutes to present on the revised red line rules, sort of the final closing. And then we would adjourn until Friday, November 20th at 9 a.m., in which case we would undertake final deliberations on the 1200 series, as well as a final vote on mission change rules as a whole. So 2 through 6, 8, 9, and 12. So that's my understanding of the schedule. I think we've had a good day of deliberation and hearing from folks, and we want to continue to appreciate our stakeholders. And unless there's anything further good for the cause, I think we're looking for a motion to adjourn until Wednesday, November 18th at 1 p.m.
So moved.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. We generally don't discuss such a motion, so all those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Good work, folks. We're adjourned. We'll see you in Wednesday at 1 p.m. And staff, thank you so much for your dedication and work that I know you're going to go do over the next 24 to 48 hours. So thank you.
Thank you, team.